Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the shadows of Italy's underworld, into the kind of story where silence earns more than noise ever could. Picture this, a small, unassuming town just outside Naples. It's the kind of place with clotheslines between balconies, espresso steam curling from every bar, and old men playing cards under vines. Nothing seems out of place until you learn someone in that calm haze is quietly laundering hundreds of millions for one of the most feared crime syndicates in the world. His name? Antonio Iovine. But you won't find many who've seen him in the flesh. Not clearly, anyway. Not without blurred features or backlit photos. In a world obsessed with digital footprints, this man walked without leaving a toe print. And somehow, in doing almost nothing loudly, he became the most powerful, invisible banker the Camorra ever had. Tonight, you'll follow a path paved in balance sheets and burner phones, through the back alleys of Naples and the icy calm of Swiss banks. It's going to be quiet, but make no mistake, this story isn't gentle. You probably wouldn't last 10 minutes in the room where he approved a wire transfer worth your entire town. And no one ever knew what bank it went to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A warm summer breeze drifts over San Cipriano d'Aversa, the kind of place where dusk arrives early and every third cousin is a priest or a produce seller. It's not the sort of town that raises billionaires, but even as a boy, Antonio Iovine doesn't fit neatly into the scenery. He's quiet. Strangely quiet. The other kids scamper between citrus trees and market stalls, but Antonio is the one watching the exchange rate posted on the tobacconist's window. He doesn't smile much, but his eyes flicker when the numbers change. His father isn't a mob boss, not even a soldier. He works at a garage. His mother, stern but clean, sells lace at the Tuesday market. There are whispers that an uncle may have known someone back in the day. But in the Camorra's ecosystem, that's like saying your neighbor knows someone who once drove past Rome. Everyone's connected, sort of. But Antonio's early connection to the underworld isn't about muscle or vengeance. It's about margin. By his teenage years, he's learning the value of silence. While others shout, he listens. He's that boy who hears the accountant mumble about missing invoices. He's the one who notices the bakery's third register is never open but always full. He starts spending afternoons with men twice his age, not because they like him, but because he doesn't talk. That's a rare trait in a place where gossip is the second currency. There's a local bookie named Gennaro who starts paying attention. Gennaro isn't a violent man, but he's made a career turning small debts into long-term servitude. He sees in Antonio not just potential, but precision. At 15, the boy is running ledgers for him. Not in the crude columns you'd expect, but balanced sheets, color-coded, margin-analyzed, loss-proofed, and somehow Antonio always knows how much money is missing before anyone notices it's gone. Many people still think that Antonio's early genius was luck, or maybe he had a hidden mentor. So, what do you think? Was he born this way, or was someone quietly training him from behind the curtain? Either way, by 18, Antonio isn't just managing petty bets. He's optimizing a network. He recommends diversifying credit schemes. He redesigns payout schedules. He advises Gennaro to stop using cash for everything. Because, as Antonio gently puts it, cash smells like fear. Use paper. Make it legal, even if it's not. This is the first time he gets noticed by someone higher, someone in the Casalesi clan. These aren't your average street hustlers. The Casalesi are the refined branch of the Camorra. Suits over tattoos, spreadsheets over stabbings, and they're very interested in this silent boy with a mind like a calculator and the spine of a monk. A car arrives one evening, nondescript except for the smell of imported cigars. A man named Enzo steps out, gives Antonio's father a thick envelope, and tells him, "Your son has a future. Don't ask questions." His father nods once. That's all it takes. By 22, Antonio Iovine disappears from town. Not because he's hiding, but because he's ascending. No one talks about where he went. Some say Switzerland, others say Argentina. The truth? He's everywhere and nowhere. And when he returns 5 years later, he's dressed too plain for someone who now owns half the buildings downtown. Quietly, of course. He doesn't swagger, doesn't throw money around. But property deeds shift hands with his name buried 3 layers deep in the ownership structure. A supermarket changes suppliers, and somehow, Antonio's cousin owns the new shipping company. A local priest gets an anonymous donation, and a new confessional booth made from Brazilian hardwood. Still, no violence, no obvious crimes, just perfect silence and very efficient wealth redistribution. The first real historical event that brushes against his rising tide happens in 1994. Italy signs the Schengen Agreement, easing border restrictions. For most, it means easier vacations. For Antonio, it means something else entirely. The flow of untraceable money just got legal paper shoes. He begins structuring assets across France, Germany, and Belgium, using shell companies registered to Romanian janitors and widows in Naples who don't even know they own anything. There's a story, probably exaggerated, that he once ran a business in Germany using an identity stolen from a man who never left his village. The tax returns were so immaculate, the man got an award from a local chamber of commerce. He still doesn't know what for. Do you remember the day he left with the first money? That quiet exit from San Cipriano? By now, it's legend, because everyone assumes the town raised a ghost, and in many ways, it did. And here's the thing about ghosts. You don't see them, but they move things. Quietly, decisively, and always in ways that make the living feel unsure. Antonio Iovine, Camorra's invisible banker, has just begun. Antonio Iovine walks through Naples the way a shadow glides under a street lamp, present but unnoticed. He doesn't need a disguise. In a city where everyone looks twice at the loud ones, being dull is the perfect camouflage. His shoes are always clean, but not new. His shirts never wrinkle, yet never shine. If you bumped into him at a post office, you'd apologize, then forget him instantly. But inside his briefcase, an old leather thing with worn stitching, is a rotating set of codes, contact logs, and figures so large they make your average CEO look like a paperboy. And in this world of Camorra economics, Antonio isn't playing hide and seek. He's rewriting the rules entirely. By the mid-90s, the Casalesi clan, his patrons, mentors, and occasional business partners, have grown tired of blood-stained headlines. Murders are messy, noisy, and expensive. But financial crime? Now that's clean. That's elegant. And most importantly, it doesn't frighten investors. Enter Antonio, their quiet revolution. He proposes a radical idea. Let's stop behaving like criminals. Let's behave like accountants who forgot to smile. It's said half-jokingly during a dinner in a countryside villa, somewhere between the pasta course and the espresso. But the men around him don't laugh. They nod. Because Antonio, young, clean, barely 30, is offering them something far more potent than loyalty: stability. So begins the transformation. Under his direction, the Casalesi don't just collect protection money. They issue false contracts. They don't bribe officials. They establish public-private partnerships. They build industrial parks no one ever uses and lease them to ghost firms that still claim subsidies. It's corruption, yes, but it wears a suit and ties its own tie. Meanwhile, Antonio remains unseen. He hires lawyers who never meet him. He controls buildings he's never set foot in. The only evidence of his presence? Perfection. That, and the unnerving quiet that follows wherever his name is whispered. By 1997, the Camorra's profit margins have ballooned. Antonio's laundromats, pizzerias in Belgium, gas stations in Slovakia, convenience stores in Marseille are humming, not with customers, but with invoices, tax records, and just enough real traffic to pass a surprise inspection. One Interpol officer later says, "It's like the guy turned criminal finance into a concept art installation. Everything was technically legal until you realized it wasn't." That year, a small but telling moment. A restaurant in Munich is raided for tax evasion. Nothing dramatic, just an anonymous tip. Investigators find discrepancies, but no direct link to Antonio. Still, among the documents they seize, there's a delivery invoice for Neapolitan tomatoes. The sender? A company based in a Naples suburb, registered to an 83-year-old who died 5 years ago. The signature on the form? A perfect replica of his daughter's, who, conveniently, doesn't exist. The restaurant quietly reopens 3 weeks later. New owners, same suppliers. This is Antonio's genius. He doesn't remove problems. He edits them, like a spreadsheet error corrected mid-cell, leaving no trace. And it's not just the Camorra who benefits. By the late 90s, Antonio begins extending his services to, let's call them parallel actors. Albanian traffickers moving contraband from the Balkans. Nigerian cells looking for quiet ways to invest in Italian land. Even remnants of ex-Soviet networks, trying to stabilize assets in case their new oligarchs implode. Everyone wants what Antonio offers: invisibility, structure, and quiet profit. But there's one historical moment he didn't expect to matter as much as it did: the introduction of the euro. In 1999, when the euro is introduced as an accounting currency, the European economy experiences a rebirth. For ordinary citizens, it means a simpler wallet. For Antonio, it means nirvana. Now cash can flow between borders without suspicion. Exchange rates? Obsolete. Regional loopholes? Abundant. And thanks to bureaucratic overlap, no one really knows who's checking what anymore. So what does Antonio do? He builds shells within shells. A Belgian bakery sells flour to a German logistics company, which then invoices a Spanish tomato farm. The tomato farm pays a Polish vineyard, which ships crates to a fake Belgian address. The final payment? Laundered through a Monaco-based accounting firm with real employees who don't realize their salaries are ghost-funded. And all of this connects back to one apartment above a butcher shop in Naples, a place with no mailbox and no doorbell. Many people still think that the European Central Bank unknowingly approved several of Antonio's paper trails during its early audits. So what do you think? Was the euro rollout a catalyst, or just a convenient storm? Regardless, by the early 2000s, Antonio's network is worth more than most Italian corporations. And yet, The man still walks like someone expecting rain, head slightly down, coat collar up, wallet in the front pocket. His contacts are few. He uses multiple phones, each stored in different items, one inside a pen, one in a lighter, one in a pack of chewing gum. Each number exists for 3 days. After that, they vanish, like his signature. There's a story his driver tells years later, that once, during a long trip between Rome and Bologna, Antonio spent 3 hours rebalancing ledgers in silence, then laughed, once, when he realized a German customs officer had signed off on a shell company he created using the name of a fictional detective from an old TV show. It's moments like this that define him. Not just brilliance, but a kind of casual irreverence for the system. He doesn't hate the law. He just doesn't believe it's written for people like him. Still, there's a price. He's rarely seen with friends. His family life, while not loveless, is strained by constant distance. He rents villas for them, but rarely visits. He sends gifts with no notes. When his son turns 8, Antonio arranges for a birthday clown who turns out to be a former accountant. Just in case, he told the courier. He wants to learn early. And yet, even in all this quiet orchestration, Antonio keeps one foot in the dirt. He visits San Cipriano twice a year. He walks the same path he did as a teenager, past the tobacconist, the bakery, the same laundry lines. He never stays more than an hour. But those visits, they fuel legend. Children whisper that he's invisible. Teenagers swear they saw his face once, reflected in a car mirror. Old men shake their heads, saying, if he were really guilty, he'd be dead by now. And maybe that's the most telling sign of all, because in the Camorra, silence is usually fatal. But Antonio's silence, it earns interest. By the turn of the millennium, Antonio Iovine isn't just running numbers. He's rearranging Europe's underworld supply chain like it's a Sunday Sudoku. He's traded the roar of motorbikes and the paranoia of corner watches for a different currency entirely: plausibility. If you looked at his empire from above, it wouldn't resemble a syndicate. It would look like a poorly regulated multinational holding company, which in fairness, it absolutely was. The Casalese clan begins operating like a venture capital firm with a very firm policy on silence. Their investments range from pharmaceuticals to logistics, from housing developments to waste management. Some of it's legal. Most of it, designed to be legal until someone looks too closely. And that's the thing. No one does. Because Antonio ensures every layer has another decoy beneath it. Every transaction folds into another jurisdiction. Every name is borrowed, every signature practiced. No violence, no bribes in envelopes, just well-dressed middlemen in softly lit cafes, agreeing on numbers and nodding politely over sparkling water. It's during this time that Antonio starts building his most impressive contraption yet, a network of European-based businesses so convincing, even the employees don't realize they're puppets in a laundering opera. Picture this: a chain of mid-sized grocery stores in southern France. Bright aisles, clean tiles, modest foot traffic. The staff are real. The products are mostly fresh. But the supply chain? Fictional. Invoices flow from a seafood distributor in Portugal. Except it doesn't exist. The shrimp never left the coast. The trucks were rented for appearance only. The driver clocks in, but the deliveries? Fabricated. This isn't criminal enterprise in the traditional sense. It's a diorama of capitalism, carefully constructed to bleed cash cleanly across borders. The real magic, though, lies in the accounting. Antonio, ever the silent conductor, implements rotating audit teams. Once a quarter, financial advisors review each business. These auditors, legitimate firms, reputable even. But here's the twist. They're selected through intermediaries who unknowingly base their reviews on doctored ledgers fed from servers in Liechtenstein. Each audit comes back clean. Each file is sealed. The cycle continues. One fiscal expert later confessed under oath, "It was a masterpiece. You'd have to want to see it to notice." And no one wanted to. And where does Antonio go during all this? Nowhere obvious. He's not in Marbella. He doesn't summer in Dubai. He's rumored to rent simple houses in Slovenia, Croatia, and once, oddly, Scotland. Always short-term, always cash up front. No trails, no selfies. Just a man, a laptop, and a locked briefcase. One night in 2002, he reportedly dines alone at a trattoria in Siena. The waiter remembers him asking, "Do you accept crypto?" 3 years before anyone else knew what that meant. Many people still think that Antonio had early access to Bitcoin through darknet trial phases, years before it became public. So what do you think? Visionary or opportunist? Meanwhile, law enforcement begins to murmur. Interpol starts collating oddities, disappearing shell companies, recycled tax IDs, duplicated import declarations. The pattern is faint, but present. And almost every trail, if followed long enough, leads to Naples, or more precisely, to the area around Naples. Because pinpointing Antonio is like trying to smell a scent that's been washed from the air. There's one breakthrough. In 2003, a mid-level courier named Matteo, nicknamed Il Gatto for his nervous energy and too slick hair, gets pulled over near the Brenner Pass. Routine stop. Nothing dramatic. Except the officers, bored and under quota, decide to inspect the van more closely. They find a false panel. Inside, 4 briefcases. Each one contains account summaries, real estate deeds, and wire logs linking 10 different businesses across 7 countries, all tied to entities managed by the same law firm in Naples. The law firm is legitimate. The paperwork is perfect. But the phone number listed for contact leads to a disconnected burner. Matteo, of course, knows nothing. Just a driver, paid cash, given sealed cargo. But this is the moment when authorities start forming the first clear picture. Someone with unnerving intelligence, is coordinating a continental shadow economy. And the top suspect? A ghost named Antonio Iovine. Still, they can't find him. Why? Because even in his absence, his world keeps humming, like a machine that refuels itself. In San Cipriano d'Aversa, locals still speak his name only at dusk. There's a bakery whose owner swears Antonio came in once in 2004, bought a loaf of bread, and left $500 on the counter. The woman still keeps the bill, framed. Not because of what it's worth, but because of what it meant. He's watching, she says. He still cares about the street. There's a warmth there, oddly. Antonio doesn't threaten his hometown. He protects it. Children get scholarships from unknown donors. Streets get paved without council votes. Trash disappears overnight. Everyone knows who's behind it. No one says a word, and at the same time, his financial reach continues to grow. He's now rumored to have holdings in South America, specifically Colombia and Brazil. Not in drugs, but in distribution. He doesn't touch product. He builds routes, cold storage facilities, import-export stations, logistics corridors that happen to also move cocaine, but that's someone else's problem. The beauty of it all? Plausible deniability. If questioned, Antonio can say, "I own trucks. What people put inside is not my business." And for a long time, that's enough. But something shifts in 2005, not with Antonio, but with the people around him. A younger generation rises in the Camorra. And they're flashier, less patient. They like being seen. They crave social media fame, even in the shadows. And Antonio? He's an old book, a relic of discretion. They respect him, but they don't understand him. And that misunderstanding begins to fray the edges of his careful tapestry. One young associate gets photographed wearing a watch only Antonio's circle could afford. It ends up on a blog. That blog gets indexed. 3 weeks later, a financial crimes unit in Milan cross-references serial numbers and connects the watch to a Swiss sale authorized by a holding company in Luxembourg, owned in part by a trust registered to an Antonio Iovine. It's the first official link in years, but even then, they can't catch him, because Antonio, sensing the wind's shift, moves again. This time, not just locations, but roles. He begins delegating more. His briefcase appears in other hands. His voice, filtered through encrypted calls and proxy negotiators, becomes a ghost of itself. And just like that, he becomes what he always wanted to be. Structure without presence. Power without proximity. Do you remember the Munich pizzeria? By 2006, it's now a wine distributor. Same owner, same ledger formatting. But the profits tripled. Antonio's magic wasn't just in hiding. It was in teaching systems how to survive without him. Still, somewhere in a countryside villa, under a different name and face, the ghost watches and waits. Somewhere between Naples and the Swiss border, there's a stretch of road winding through low hills and vineyards. Not scenic, not touristy, just the kind of place that passes by without asking to be remembered. But if you were to stand quietly there in 2006, you might have seen a modest sedan glide through, its driver careful, unremarkable. In the back seat, Antonio Iovine, the man with the neatest books in Europe and no passport under his real name. At this point, Antonio isn't merely operating within the Camorra, he's transcending it. His name, though seldom spoken aloud, has become shorthand among international money launderers for a gold standard in discretion. You don't hire Iovine. You send a signal, and if you're lucky, someone who knows someone responds with a blank contract and a clock. By now, his clients aren't just criminal enterprises. They include legitimate businessmen trying to hide less than legitimate acquisitions, politicians looking to move campaign funds far from the curious eyes of regulators, even a handful of bankers, yes, bankers, who'd rather not explain sudden windfalls to compliance officers with unusually sharp pencils. And yet, Antonio's brilliance isn't in complexity, it's in cleanliness. His systems are simple because they're precise. Every euro is accounted for. Every transaction leaves a digital footprint that ends in a legitimate source, even if that source is built on lies. But let's talk about his laundromats, his favorite term for front-facing businesses. You've heard of pizzerias and car washes. Now imagine this, a chain of second-hand electronic stores in Belgium. Nothing fancy. Shelves of used phones, discount routers, half-priced microwaves. They open quietly. They're always clean. They rarely have customers, but every month they report steady revenue. Consistent enough to avoid suspicion, just noisy enough to pass audits. Inside the back office, a server with encrypted logs, funneling fake sales data into a consolidated ledger accessed once a week from a secure connection in southern Italy. It's these operations that baffle investigators the most. One Dutch officer famously said, "We kept trying to prove it was illegal, but it was just implausible. Like watching a magician shuffle cards and realizing the deck was blank." And while those cards shuffle, Antonio spends his evenings somewhere quieter. He prefers the countryside, always rented, never owned. He walks alone, reads alone, and occasionally meets men in cafes who smile too quickly and leave too soon. It's during one of these stays, in an olive farm outside Siena, that he receives word of trouble. A courier has gone missing. Now, this isn't unusual in the underworld. Couriers go missing all the time. But this one? He was carrying a ledger, a real one. Paper. Antonio almost never uses paper. It's a lapse, a moment of old-school nostalgia, perhaps. The ledger contains coded records of shell payments stretching back 6 years. And worse, it includes initials. Not names, just initials. But for someone smart enough, that's all it takes. Antonio doesn't panic. He recalibrates. He shuts down 17 shell companies in 2 hours. Contacts a real estate lawyer in Lisbon to transfer 3 properties into a new trust. Replaces 2 regional accountants. And just for good measure, reassigns a grocery chain's entire supplier pipeline within 3 days. The result? Investigators looking at the ledger, once they retrieve it, find outdated records, closed accounts, and corporations that no longer exist. Like trying to catch a mouse in a house that's already been demolished. But the incident changes him. He becomes even more remote. Phone calls become rarer. Instructions are sent via handwritten notes, then burned. Meetings are held in places with no cameras. Flower markets, church festivals, cemeteries, and still he grows. By 2007, his reach is extended to Canada and the Middle East. Rumors swirl of construction contracts in Qatar, retail arms in Toronto, and even a seafood export business in Hong Kong. Nothing direct. Always through layers. But the scent is there. For those who know how to smell, one peculiar example. A nightclub in Toronto, known for its imported Italian wines. Its owner, a cheerful man named Rocco, claims to be a simple importer, but when pressed, can't quite explain how his accountant always seems to predict currency shifts weeks before they happen. The answer? Antonio, of course. Through a shell corporation in Malta, he's been feeding the man currency hedge data based on illicit market trends. In exchange, a monthly dividend that finds its way back into the Casalese clan's trust portfolio. This is the genius. Antonio doesn't just launder money. He invests it, grows it, curates it. His empire doesn't rot from hidden cash. It blossoms from reinvestment. And yet, despite all this, no one knows what he sounds like. Think about that. A man with his hands in billions, untouchable, unspeaking, unseen. Even prosecutors have no confirmed recordings of his voice. Only whispers, only educated guesses. Many people still think that the few times he was heard on surveillance tapes, it was a stand-in, someone trained to mimic his speech patterns. So what do you think? Could a voice be forged for 15 years? In the heart of Naples, investigators grow restless. Operation Spartacus, aimed at dismantling the Casalese leadership, intensifies. Dozens are arrested. Trials begin. Names get named. But Antonio? He remains a ghost. Even as old friends turn, no one gives him up. Why? Because Antonio never leaves fingerprints. Not just physically, but emotionally. He's too distant to betray. He inspires awe, not loyalty. And awe, it turns out, keeps secrets better. Still, one figure begins to worry. Don Michel, a senior in the Casalese hierarchy. The Don is old school. He believes in eyes, in presence, in pressure. And he doesn't like that the money moves without his touch. Their last meeting, held at a vineyard under the guise of a wedding rehearsal, isn't hostile, but it is tense. Michel wants updates. He wants visibility. Antonio offers spreadsheets, graphs, projected dividends. The Don shakes his head. Money is not enough, he mutters. Antonio replies, calm, composed. It always has been. And then he leaves. That night, The Don has a mild stroke. He survives, but retires shortly after. Some say it was natural. Others, well, they say power shifts without needing poison. By the end of 2007, Antonio is the de facto strategist of the Camorra. Not a boss, not a capo, just a man whose phone never rings, and yet every plan requires his silent nod. He doesn't attend meetings. He sets their agendas. He doesn't kill. He decides who gets to live in comfort. And in a nondescript farmhouse near Caserta, behind biometric locks and 2 layers of decoy entrances, Antonio begins designing something even grander. An offshore bank. Not a real bank, of course, but a network so tight, so cleverly mirrored in legitimate structures, that for a brief moment in early 2008, one major French bank unknowingly transfers funds into a holding account co-owned by a Camorra front. The wire goes through, the money vanishes, not stolen, redirected, cleaned, reborn. And the man behind it? Still no photos, still no statements, still just a whisper. It's 2008, and the world is trembling beneath the weight of a global financial crisis. Markets collapse, banks fold, governments panic. CEOs give press conferences with pale faces and shaky hands. But in a small, barely habitable villa on the outskirts of Caserta, one man is sipping espresso with the stillness of a monk. Antonio Iovine doesn't flinch when the world economy takes a nosedive. In fact, he anticipates it, almost too perfectly. While other investors are screaming into phones, Antonio is rerouting assets, shifting funds into commodities, and quietly buying undervalued properties in 4 countries. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't even raise an eyebrow, because for him, volatility is just another tool. And in this case, it's a golden opportunity. You see, when markets are in chaos, oversight becomes sloppy. Institutions scramble to cover their own mess. Governments loosen restrictions to encourage liquidity. And in that haze of panic and deregulation, Antonio slips in like mist through a cracked window. One mainstream historical fact here. In 2008, the European Central Bank slashed interest rates and initiated emergency liquidity measures to stabilize the Eurozone. While this was meant to help struggling economies, it also opened wide loopholes for shadow money to move under the radar. Antonio takes full advantage. He begins flooding the market with acquisitions, through shell buyers, of course, entire apartment blocks in Milan, logistics warehouses near Lyon, and commercial kitchens in Vienna, all purchased quietly, legally, and with cash that technically no longer exists. Each purchase is routed through a legitimate business vehicle. Each file has signatures, tax IDs, even meeting minutes of fake board members. It's said that one of the fake companies held a quarterly shareholders meeting in a Prague hotel conference room, complete with catered sandwiches and stand-in actors. When a journalist tried to attend, he was politely asked to leave by a man in a charcoal suit who spoke 5 languages and vanished afterward. Antonio calls this camouflage through realism. You don't hide a lie under silence. You bury it in so much performance it becomes boring. And the government? Too busy saving banks to look into pizzerias that report modest profits and never miss a tax deadline. But something else happens in 2008. Something unexpected. The Italian government starts shifting focus, not just to mafia bosses with guns, but to white-collar operators behind the scenes. They begin assembling a special task force, a hybrid unit combining financial analysts, cybercrime experts, and old-school anti-mafia detectives who still remember the smell of fear in back rooms. Their mission? Identify, locate, and bring down the ghosts. And at the top of that list, Antonio Iovine. They give him a name. Il commercialista invisibile, the invisible accountant. For the first time, authorities stop chasing his companies and start chasing his style. They begin to notice patterns, documents that feel too perfect, ownership transfers that happen just before an audit, businesses that never seem to fail even in recessions. The net tightens, but Antonio is ready. One of his most impressive evasions comes during this time. A bank in Luxembourg is subpoenaed for information on a trust that owns 14 properties in Italy. The authorities suspect money laundering. They expect to find fake names, overseas account dumps, forged signatures. Instead, they find an immaculate trail. Every form is correct. Every signature matches. Every transfer aligns with national laws. And yet, the beneficial owner listed, a Panamanian foundation, registered to a deceased nun. Now, normally, that would raise alarms. But the nun died only 2 months ago, and the foundation was registered 3 months prior, which means, technically, the owner was alive at the time. It's a bureaucratic dead end, and this is the moment investigators start whispering something dangerous. Maybe he's untouchable, not invincible, just beyond the reach of ordinary systems. Many people still think that the Panamanian nun was fabricated entirely, an identity built from fragments of old census records. So what do you think? A real ghost? Or just another of Antonio's paper shadows? Even within the Camorra, his legend starts to grow taller. Young lieutenants idolize him. They call him Zio Fantasma, Uncle Ghost. They mimic his style, wear modest suits, quote spreadsheets they barely understand. But imitation doesn't come with comprehension. One group in Salerno tries to recreate Antonio's laundering system, but gets sloppy. They funnel money through fake charities and end up exposed when one of their beneficiaries turns out to be a YouTube fitness influencer who posts about it publicly. Antonio, furious, he sends no threat, no warning, just cuts the funding pipeline instantly. The message is clear. Sloppiness isn't just a risk, it's betrayal. And betrayal is the only sin Antonio won't tolerate. Meanwhile, his personal world becomes even quieter. He no longer lives anywhere full-time. He rotates between 5 properties, all off-grid. Each is guarded not by men with guns, but by silence, loyalty, and isolation. One villa is hidden behind a vineyard with fake ownership records. Another is accessible only via an unmarked road through a goat pasture. His meals are simple: vegetables from nearby markets, bread he bakes himself, a bottle of wine every Sunday, always local. No visitors except for 1 or 2 trusted associates who bring updates, USB drives, and fresh burner phones. A former associate describes one such visit. He was barefoot, cooking something with olive oil and rosemary. Didn't even look up. Just said, "The market's about to shift. Move everything out of Spain." Then went back to stirring the pot. Even in isolation, Antonio sees the chessboard. He starts restructuring his empire again. This time, not just to protect it, but to future-proof it. He anticipates digital forensics, begins wiping server trails, encrypts logs with custom ciphers, implements a policy. Nothing survives more than 6 months. After that, data self-erases, contracts dissolve, companies are retired like aging actors. He even has a phrase for it: l'algoritmo della nebbia, the fog algorithm. It's not a system. It's a principle. Nothing concrete, nothing long-term, just constant drift. Let the world chase something that changes shape as it moves. And all the while, authorities creep closer. They're watching his suspected properties, monitoring phone towers, tapping people they think are connected to him. But Antonio? He's listening too. He installs scanners in his villas that detect surveillance frequencies, hires former intelligence operatives to review building layouts, even pays a retired telecom engineer to help reroute fiber lines, just in case. One night, while sitting alone in a villa in the hills of Molise, he hears the faint click of a power box being accessed. No panic. He just opens his laptop, transfers 4 accounts, and leaves. 45 minutes later, the villa is empty. The refrigerator light still glows, the coffee cup still warm, but Antonio is gone. Again. Do you remember the courier with the lost ledger? That mistake changed Antonio. But this confirms what he always believed. They'll never stop looking, so I must never stop vanishing. By early 2009, the phrase, "we almost had him," becomes a chorus inside Italy's anti-mafia offices. Investigators speak of Antonio Iovine like a myth they once glimpsed, a ripple on a lake, a shadow behind glass. The closer they think they are, the further he actually is. But something curious begins to happen. While authorities scramble to pin him down physically, Antonio's systems seem to pause, not collapse, not unravel, but slow. Shell companies begin dissolving. Asset flows taper. New fronts are no longer opening at the same velocity. At first, this looks like a retreat, like maybe the ghost is getting tired. But those who understand Iovine know better. He's pruning. Behind closed doors, doors that only open once, if ever, Antonio is making space for something larger. He starts consolidating. Instead of dozens of small operations scattered across Europe, he begins linking them under umbrella structures. A construction firm in Munich now belongs to a Luxembourg trust, which owns a logistics group in Bari, which controls a development company in Prague. It's vertical integration, not of products but of control, at the core of it all. A financial holding group called Atrium Investments, registered in Liechtenstein, with sub-entities in Dubai and Panama. On paper, it's a perfectly legal financial services conglomerate. But investigators, those who've been watching, see through the sheen. They begin calling it the cathedral, because it's grand, intricate, and, for all intents and purposes, holy in the eyes of international finance. But inside, it's all Antonio. And he's growing bolder. Take this. In the spring of 2009, a Belgian customs officer flags a shipment of glass tiles en route to Rotterdam. The weight doesn't match the invoice. Upon inspection, the crates contain not tiles, but dozens of Italian espresso machines, each with false compartments. Inside those compartments, contracts, financial records, backup drives. None of it illegal on its own, but together, a spider web leading back to Atrium. Antonio's response? He simply reroutes the pipeline. Within days, the shipping operation is moved to a lesser-known Baltic port. Same product, different name. Crates marked kitchen fixtures. But this is where something begins to shift, because now it's not just Antonio adapting, it's the state, the task force. Once a mix of regional detectives and overstretched bureaucrats, evolves. They bring in specialists, blockchain analysts, offshore banking experts, even a psychologist who studies behavioral patterns of high-functioning criminal strategists. Their conclusion? Antonio doesn't behave like a criminal. He behaves like a sovereign entity, and that makes him dangerous in a new way. One of the team leaders reportedly said, "He isn't hiding from us. He's working around us. We're just background noise." That same summer, authorities freeze accounts tied to a suspected shell firm in Cyprus. The name on the paperwork? GM Castelli, an alias tied to old Camorra accounts. But here's the twist. The account hadn't been accessed in over 2 years. And yet, the day after the freeze, The building owned by that account burns down in an electrical accident. No injuries, no arrests, just a blank lot and a very clean insurance claim. When questioned, locals shrug. Must have been a wiring problem. The owner was someone from Naples, we think. It's at this point that the phrase controlled disappearance enters law enforcement vocabulary. Because Antonio isn't just avoiding detection, he's selectively erasing parts of himself. A hotel chain he once used for financial transfers, sold. A transport firm in Milan that once laundered euros through fuel contracts, liquidated. His presence recedes in waves, intentional, elegant, complete, and in his place, silence. Still, his most impressive maneuver during this time isn't what he erases, it's what he creates. In late 2009, an entirely new player enters the southern Italian development scene. Ponte Nuovo SPA, a mid-tier construction firm with clean books, legitimate staff, and government contracts for infrastructure improvement in earthquake-prone regions. The company wins bids, builds roads, renovates hospitals. Everything seems above board, until a whistleblower reveals that all payments are routed through a payment processor in the Netherlands, one historically tied to Camorra adjacent entities. Guess who designed the routing? Antonio. But here's the thing. He doesn't appear anywhere on paper. Not as founder, not as board member, not even as an advisor. He's just felt the architectural designs, pulled from a firm he once financed. The audit trail? Flawless, except it loops back to a server in Argentina that no one seems able to access, and yet the roads are paved. The hospitals stand. People benefit. So, when authorities try to intervene, they hit a wall of public support. The mayor of one town reportedly said, "I don't care who built it. The maternity ward works. We owe him." Many people still think that Antonio purposefully built clean projects just to secure public protection. So what do you think? Manipulation? Or modern-day Machiavelli? But there's one detail no one forgets. While all this happens, Antonio's actual whereabouts remain unknown. Interpol tracks signals near the Slovenian border, then a ping from Albania, then silence. One theory, he's living aboard a ship, a retrofitted cargo vessel that never docks, just circles the Mediterranean, changing flags, maintaining satellite uplink. On board, a single cabin. One man, 5 monitors, and the sea. Do you remember the farmhouse he fled after the power box clicked? Since then, he's never stayed anywhere longer than 12 days. He communicates now only through signal packets, short bursts of data sent through a labyrinth of relays. His messages are reduced to fragments, coordinates, numbers, short affirmations. His empire still running, but its king completely ghosted. And as 2010 creeps in, a quiet tension grips the investigation. They know he's out there. They know he's watching. They just don't know what comes next. The year is 2010. In a small apartment tucked behind a shuttered storefront in Casal di Principe, a woman sets a mocha pot on the stove and listens. Not for footsteps, not for cars. She's listening for silence. The kind of silence that precedes change. In Camorra country, silence is never empty. It's a message, a warning, sometimes a farewell. And this year, silence is about to be broken. For over a decade, Antonio Iovine has moved like vapor, seeping through bureaucratic cracks, slipping past microphones, building an empire from whispers and spreadsheets. But the longer you run without touching the ground, the more the world starts to feel the tremors of your passing. And in 2010, the ground starts to shake. The anti-mafia task force, restructured, rearmed, and reinvigorated, is no longer chasing shadows. They're predicting movement. They've stopped asking where Antonio is and started asking, where would he have to be to make this work? It begins with a tomato farm, not in Naples, not even in Italy, but in southern Spain. A quiet agricultural enterprise that just happens to be receiving irregular shipments of soil conditioning chemicals from a warehouse in Bulgaria. Odd, but not illegal, until investigators trace the payments to a consultancy in Milan that, 3 years prior, listed Antonio Iovine's cousin as its acting CFO. Nothing sticks, nothing ever does, but it's enough to get the right phone tapped. And that phone leads them to a voice, a careful one, speaking in clipped syllables, almost scripted. The voice doesn't say names, it references numbers, dates, movements, and in between those coded remarks is a single phrase that sends ripples through the room. Il fratello non scende più. The brother no longer descends. The team listening in leans forward, because Il fratello, the brother, is one of Antonio's few known nicknames among his inner circle. Suddenly, the silence has texture. And that's when everything changes. Back in Italy, surveillance tightens. Old safe houses are dusted for prints. Informants are squeezed for fragments. And slowly, a picture begins to form. Not of a man on the run, but a man anchored somewhere just out of view. Turns out, Antonio has been hiding not in Switzerland, nor Slovenia, nor some offshore maritime fantasy. He's closer than anyone dared to assume, a tomato farm, but not the one in Spain, a new one, tucked into the hills of Casal di Principe, just a few kilometers from the town where he grew up. It's almost poetic. The man who spent his life vanishing into borders, laundering cash through continents, choosing exile over exposure, has quietly returned to the dirt roads of his youth. But this is no ordinary farm. The property is deceptively modest. Low stucco buildings, a few fields, a rusting tractor under a lean-to. From the road, it looks abandoned. Even the mailbox is fake. But beneath the surface, biometric locks, reinforced steel doors, a panic tunnel lined with olive crates. Inside, one investigator would later say, it looked like a tech startup built by someone who didn't want to be found. A laptop sits on a table surrounded by neatly stacked files, USB sticks arranged like chess pieces, a coffee cup, still warm. Antonio has been here, likely within the hour. But catching a ghost isn't about luck, it's about rhythm. And for once, investigators find themselves in sync with his. They don't storm the compound. They wait. Patiently. For 3 full days, agents watch the farm from an unmarked van under the cover of a fruit delivery route. And then, just before sunrise on the 4th day, it happens. A silver hatchback approaches. Slow, cautious, windows tinted. It idles for a moment, then eases toward the garage. When the agents move in, it's quiet, just like him. They enter with surgical calm. No shouting, no crash of doors, no drawn weapons. And there he is, Antonio Iovine, standing in the doorway of his own security bunker, wearing soft slippers and a thin wool sweater. He doesn't run, doesn't speak, just looks at the nearest officer and gives a single nod. One agent, later interviewed, described it as a nod not of surrender, but of inevitability, like he'd already gamed this moment out a dozen ways, and this was the cleanest one. The arrest is made without incident, no resistance, no phone calls, just a man quietly folding into custody. It makes the evening news, but not with fireworks, just a line. Antonio Iovine, alleged financial brain of the Camorra, arrested in Caserta. No blood, no chase, just a whisper, finally caught. Many people still think the man arrested wasn't Antonio at all, that it was a double, a trained mimic planted to end the hunt while the real Iovine fades into legend. So what do you think? Would the real ghost really get caught that close to home? In the holding cell, Antonio says nothing. He doesn't ask for a lawyer, doesn't call family, doesn't even blink when they read him the charges. Instead, he sits, shoulders relaxed, hands folded, eyes distant, and in a strange, almost disarming twist, the very first thing he does when given access to reading materials, he requests a copy of the Italian tax code. When asked why, he replies softly, "I'm behind on the updates." Meanwhile, across Europe, tiny earthquakes rumble through the financial systems he once touched. Contracts are frozen. Shell firms evaporate. Businesses quietly change hands, but not all of them. Some continue, untouched, as if they never needed him in the first place, because Antonio didn't build a system that depended on him. He built one that could survive him, and that, more than the money, more than the silence, is his greatest legacy. A web that doesn't collapse when the spider is removed. It should have been the end of the story. Antonio Iovine, the invisible banker, the quiet spine of the Casalese clan's global fortune, finally behind bars, arrested without drama, processed like any other suspect, photographed, fingerprinted, placed under 24-hour surveillance. But the problem with catching a ghost is this: you never know if it's the real one until long after the haunting stops. Within hours of the arrest, the Italian press scrambles for angles. Some publish the only known photo, a blurry image of a man in handcuffs, head slightly bowed, flanked by plainclothes officers. Others speculate on his fortune, his holdings, the whispered claim that he had access to over $500 million in clean cash at any given time. And behind closed doors, prosecutors begin to plan what they hope will be a historic trial. But from the start, it's odd. Antonio doesn't speak, not in defiance, not in fear, but with the kind of serene detachment that unsettles even the most seasoned interrogators. No confessions, no names, no pleas. He just listens, calmly, correcting his posture every so often, as if the silence was his native tongue and he was back in his element. A junior prosecutor, fresh into her role, reportedly quipped, "It's like interviewing a statue that reads tax law." And maybe that's not far from the truth. Because while Antonio's voice remains locked, the evidence begins to speak in volumes. The farm where he was found yields more than just coffee and laptops. Hidden behind a false wall in the cellar are 15 external hard drives, each neatly labeled in code. The labels seem innocuous. Delivery Schedule 3, Tomato Fund, Archive, LND Docs, old. But their contents? Anything but. What unfolds is a map. A meticulous blueprint of Antonio's entire network. Hundreds of businesses, cross-border wire logs, cryptocurrency transfers, even contingency plans for rapid shutdowns. And yet, every document is scrubbed of personal ties. Not a single mention of his own name. No signatures. No voice memos. Just perfect paperwork designed to exist in a legal limbo. Technically correct, morally void, and utterly baffling to the courts. One financial crimes analyst said it best: "We caught the mind, but not the fingerprint." Still, they move forward. The court dates are set. A high-security prison cell is prepared, and a team of investigators comb through a decade's worth of corporate records, trying to piece together a prosecution case solid enough to withstand a defense built on omission. But outside the courtroom, something strange is happening. Businesses that were assumed to be fronts for Antonio's laundering begin operating normally. One of his old car washes in Amsterdam files taxes on time, reports steady profits, even upgrades its vacuum systems. A pizzeria in Lyon, long suspected of being a cash laundering site, sponsors a local football team. The frozen seafood company in Bari expands to include vegan options. It's as if Antonio's arrest had no effect at all, or worse, his system was never designed to need him. This is where the investigators begin to feel a kind of existential unease. Because if the mastermind is gone and the machine keeps running, was he ever the center, or merely the designer of a self-sustaining ghost network? Many people still think that Antonio engineered his own capture, not out of weakness, but as a pivot, a sacrifice play. One theory suggests he staged the arrest to draw attention away from a new infrastructure being built offshore. So, what do you think? Was prison the price of evolution? Inside his cell, Antonio remains disciplined. He wakes at 5:30 a.m., exercises lightly, eats all his meals, reads legal journals, accepts no visitors, save for his lawyer, a man whose demeanor mirrors Antonio's own. Quiet, firm, unimpressed. He's offered deals, lighter sentences in exchange for testimony, witness protection, even offshore amnesty, whispered in discreet tones by those hoping to avoid larger trials. But he declines them all, politely, and slowly. The myth of his silence becomes more powerful than anything he might say. A former clan associate, now in witness protection, is asked why no one dares to turn on Antonio. His response is chilling. Because you can't betray someone who never made you promise anything. Do you remember the atrium investment structure? Even now, pieces of it remain operational, albeit with new names and different shells. Investigators seize assets, but the flow continues. Contracts keep renewing. Shells dissolve and reappear like waves on a ledger. It becomes evident that Antonio's most profound accomplishment wasn't hiding his money. It was hiding its origin. He didn't bury treasure. He made it look like it had always been there. Meanwhile, his trial becomes a paradox. There are no murders to pin on him, no weapons, no wiretapped threats, just a mountain of financial transactions that lead somewhere, but never to him directly. The prosecutors present charts, diagrams, testimonies. They show that when Antonio was active, the Camorra made money cleaner, faster, and quieter than ever before. But when asked to prove that he commanded it, the case falters. The defense, equally calm, leans on absence. No recorded orders, no direct links, no ownership, just suspicion wrapped in spreadsheets. And surprisingly, it works. Not for full acquittal, but for reduction. Antonio is sentenced, yes, but not as a don, not as a capo, not even as a financier of crime. He is convicted of association with a criminal organization and conspiracy to launder money. The maximum term is imposed, but insiders call it a symbolic gesture, a declaration that even ghosts must carry shadows. He is transferred to a secure prison outside Milan. There, he continues his silence. One guard reports that he requested a chessboard and was later found playing both sides, whispering moves to himself. Another claims Antonio asked for the complete works of Machiavelli and a portable calculator. Whether these stories are real or just pieces of the growing myth doesn't matter. What matters is that the world begins to believe Antonio Iovine was never truly caught, because outside those prison walls, the wine still flows. The invoices still move. The structures he built continue breathing, and somewhere, in the folds of paper and wire, a whisper lingers. There's a certain irony to Antonio Iovine's imprisonment. A man who once moved billions without speaking a word now finds himself surrounded by conversations he has no interest in joining. The prison isn't harsh. It's one of Italy's high-security facilities for white-collar criminals and mafia affiliates. A place built less for punishment and more for containment. It has clean walls, tight routines, and guards who prefer order to confrontation. And in the corner cell of Wing C, Antonio begins to live a life measured in fluorescent cycles and mealtime trays. To the casual observer, he adjusts well. He's polite, never complains, follows the rules, keeps to himself, reads constantly, finance books, legal briefs, political theory. He requests newspapers from 5 different countries, and arranges them chronologically before reading. One fellow inmate remarks, "It was like he was auditing the world before breakfast, but what unnerves the staff isn't his intelligence. It's the way time seems to agree with him. Most inmates sag under the weight of confinement. Antonio straightens. His daily walks are measured. His writing, though sparse, is organized in bound notebooks, unlabeled, but always symmetrical. He never doodles, never scribbles. When his pencil dulls, he returns it with an apology and requests another, and still he does not speak. Not about the Camorra, not about his holdings, not about Atrium investments or the ghost accounts in Cyprus. Not even when a visiting magistrate asks gently, 'Don't you want to reclaim your legacy?' Antonio's only reply is a faint shrug, as if to say, 'What legacy would that be?' Because perhaps, from his perspective, there's nothing to reclaim, only systems to observe. Yet the world outside doesn't stop observing him. In mid-2010, following his arrest, financial investigators begin combing through thousands of company records across Europe. At first, they expect the usual suspects: fake shell firms, untraceable transfers, implausible real estate valuations. But what they uncover is something far more unsettling. Structure without presence. Antonio's creations continue to evolve in his absence. Businesses he established with mathematical precision continue reporting profits. Employee wages are paid on time, taxes filed, audits passed, some even expand. A supermarket chain in southern France launches a digital loyalty program and expands into online retail. A transportation company in Poland upgrades its fleet to electric vehicles, complete with environmental grants. The conclusion? His empire didn't need him. It just needed the template he built. Many people still think Antonio designed his operations using predictive models, algorithms that dictated behavior based on historical market patterns. So what do you think? Was he a criminal or an architect of self-operating machines? And this is when the international banking community starts whispering something radical. Not fear, not condemnation, but admiration. They don't say it publicly, of course, but behind conference doors, in risk committees and investment firm retreats, Antonio Iovine becomes a case study, not of crime, of efficiency. His holdings, those still intact, outperform expectations. His ghost companies have cleaner books than real corporations. One hedge fund analyst writes in a confidential memo, "Whoever designed this portfolio understood risk better than most CFOs in the FTSE 100. Meanwhile, inside prison, Antonio receives a letter, handwritten, no return address. It contains only a line. Il sistema è in equilibrio. The system is in balance. He folds the paper, places it inside a notebook, and returns to reading a biography of Alexander Hamilton. Then comes a peculiar moment. A university professor from Rome petitions to interview him for research on underground economies. He expects rejection, but to his surprise, Antonio agrees. The meeting lasts exactly 47 minutes. Antonio speaks finally, but only about historical market collapses. The Dutch tulip bubble, the South Sea Company, the Great Depression. He explains how emotion distorts value, how fear poisons stability, how liquidity hides fragility. The professor, wide-eyed, asks, "And the Camorra?" Antonio blinks, then says, "They panicked less than the central banks. That's all." He declines future interviews. Do you remember the tomato farm? After his arrest, it was seized and examined thoroughly. Investigators found no drugs, no weapons, no criminal correspondence. But tucked under a false floorboard, they did find a small, sealed envelope addressed simply, "Per dopo," for later. Inside was a note, written in Antonio's careful script. "By the time you find this, I'll be irrelevant. But what I built won't be." It becomes a mantra for investigators, because in the following months, more entities connected to his designs begin to surface. A minor bank in the Balkans reveals its software was adapted from a code library originating in a shell tech firm owned by, wait for it, an old bakery Antonio once financed. A frozen goods exporter in Brazil unknowingly processes payments through a legacy pipeline designed to bypass 3 audit triggers, all built by a now defunct logistics group in Hungary. He's everywhere and nowhere. But here's what surprises even the harshest critics. None of it collapses. Usually, when a financial criminal is removed, the system buckles. Debts surface. Panic spreads. But with Antonio, the inverse. His absence becomes order in court. A defense lawyer later argues, if his system wasn't criminal in design, is it criminal in execution? The room goes silent. The prosecutor responds, intent matters. Profit from crime, even if dressed well, is still crime. But there's hesitation, because this is a new kind of criminal, a man who didn't deal in threats, but in balance, who didn't demand loyalty, only precision, one magistrate writes in his final report. He was not the blood of the Camorra, he was its oxygen. Meanwhile, in prison, Antonio's health holds. He's examined regularly, eats well, sleeps without incident, never asks for special privileges. His cell is always spotless. His handwriting remains exact, sharp, and every so often, a small transfer hits a government fund. A donation, anonymous, often routed through half-forgotten trusts. When they try to trace the source, it loops 3 times and vanishes into compliance-checked silence. One investigator, flipping through the transaction logs, mutters, he's still playing, but is he? Or did he simply leave behind a machine with no off switch? Because while Antonio's voice is quiet, his echo is louder than ever. By late 2010, Antonio Iovine's name has taken on a new tone, no longer whispered in dread, nor spoken with urgency. It's now said with a kind of reverent hesitation, like the name of a monument you're not sure you're allowed to touch. In Naples and its surrounding provinces, even seasoned Camorra veterans speak of him as if he were a chapter from an older book, one written in a language no one quite remembers how to read. And yet, despite his incarceration, Il Commercialista Invisibile continues to shape the present. Let's take a curious case in Palermo. A small importing firm, San Vito Trading, suddenly triples its revenue in Q3 of 2010. The company deals in dried legumes and olive oils. Nothing glamorous. But the speed of its expansion raises eyebrows. A deeper dive reveals an intricate web of subsidiaries, each tied to shipping firms in Malta, food distributors in Northern Africa, and several non-profits that happen to share a bank in Zurich. The ledger pattern? Familiar. A regional forensic accountant sees it and mutters, it's his rhythm. The math is identical, except the records don't trace back to Antonio. Not directly, not even indirectly. The web has grown smarter, looser, dispersed. And this is when a terrifying possibility sets in. The machine may now be writing itself, whether intentionally or not. Antonio seems to have architected a model so adaptive, so deeply embedded in legitimate commerce, that its offspring continue growing, like vines climbing through cracks in the global economy. Back inside the prison, Antonio is moved to a quieter wing, not as punishment, as precaution. The guards have noticed something strange. Inmates seek him out, not to threaten him, but to consult, to ask about asset shielding, corporate bylaws, tax thresholds in foreign jurisdictions. One inmate was reportedly caught slipping Antonio a folded paper labeled Fondazione Svisa, a name that would later appear in the Panama Papers linked to offshore art investments. Antonio never answers these queries aloud, but it's said he'll sometimes return the papers with a simple smiley face. No guidance, no comment, just an emoji. And somehow, that's enough to shift behaviors across entire cells. Do you remember the professor from Rome, the one he granted a single interview? Well, word gets out, and now journalists, economists, even think tank analysts start pushing for access. They want to study him, document him, invite him to economic roundtables as a cautionary tale. He refuses them all when one reporter writes a long op-ed titled "The Mob Banker Who Understood Capitalism Better Than Economists." Antonio's lawyer forwards him a copy in case he'd like to comment. He circles one line and sends it back. The line: "If we had listened to the markets, not the ministers, 2008 would have looked different." His circle, clean, sharp, surgical. Still, prosecutors remain undeterred. They begin constructing a second case, not based on money laundering, but on criminal facilitation, a new legal framework designed for those who may not directly commit crimes, but build the architecture that allows them. They gather witnesses, old colleagues, former accountants, even a cousin once removed. And for the first time, cracks appear. One associate, under protection, says Antonio once mentioned moving the heart of the machine to South America. Another claims he had a man in the Vatican, though that part is too vague to hold in court. But the big revelation comes from a former logistics manager who, over a lunch of penne and wine, deep in a government safe house, draws a map. He sketches ports, highways, cold storage facilities, distribution chains, and at the center of it all, a vineyard, not in Italy, in Mendoza, Argentina. According to the witness, Antonio funneled money into this vineyard not to make wine, but to serve as the central ledger for a global logistics laundering scheme. Shipments came and went, labeled with varietals, Malbec, Bonarda, Torrontés, but inside the crates were contracts, crypto keys, and enough ledger fragments to make a forensic accountant cry. Authorities move fast, too fast. By the time they reach Mendoza, the vineyard is gone, burned in a brush fire. The owner? A retired mathematics professor from Cordoba who claims he never heard of Iovine and can't explain why his payroll once included 3 former Naples-based accountants. The fire is ruled accidental. And just like that, the center disappears again. Many people still think the vineyard was a decoy, a sacrificial prop, meant to be found, meant to burn. So what do you think? Did Antonio light the fire himself? From a continent away? Back in Italy, his second trial stalls. The charges are too abstract, the evidence too indirect. And Antonio remains unchanged, stoic, unbothered. At one point, the judge asks if he'd like to speak. He stands, straightens his cuffs, then says, "You cannot try architecture for what is built upon it," and sits down again. A silence settles over the courtroom. Even the reporters stop scribbling, because whether you admire him or abhor him, there's something undeniable about that sentence. It floats, heavy, like a warning, like a riddle. In the months that follow, Antonio receives letters from strangers, students, small business owners. Some thank him, some curse him, some beg him to explain how to build something, anything that lasts. He replies to none of them, except one. A 16-year-old economics student from Florence sends a handwritten note asking, "Is it true you never trusted banks?" Antonio replies with a single word, "No, I just understood them." By early 2011, Antonio Iovine is no longer just a prisoner. He's become a gravitational field, not a man, not even a myth, but a center of quiet influence. Within the prison walls, guards change routines subtly when he walks past, not out of fear, but out of symmetry. Inmates nod at him like monks greeting a fellow scribe. And outside, the economy, both legal and shadow, still ripples with every system he once touched. The authorities realize something unsettling. They may have caged the man, but they didn't catch the architect's reach. Let's go back to Atrium Investments. Since Antonio's arrest, the holding company has officially ceased operations. Documents filed, accounts closed, dissolution published in the Luxembourg registry. But something's wrong. Months after its closure, two new companies emerge in Singapore, Arcadine Logistics and Tesaro Foods Limited. They're unrelated. On paper, they deal in supply chain management and grain import. But beneath the surface, both carry subtle traces of Atrium's design. Internal document formatting, ledger notation quirks, even the way invoices are coded, always with a trailing zero, always in triplets. Coincidence? Not likely. Investigators dig deeper and find that one of the initial backers of Tesaro Foods is a trust fund set up a decade earlier by a real estate developer in Palermo, a man whose daughter once worked as a secretary at a Camorra-linked property firm in the mid-2000s. That trail is slim, legally useless, but stylistically, it screams Antonio. The term post-Iovine architecture begins to appear in Europol reports. It's not just about Antonio anymore. It's about the design principles he pioneered, replicable, elegant, and now circulating like a language among criminal financiers. And therein lies the problem. Because while Antonio remains behind bars, his ideas aren't. In fact, they're thriving. There's even chatter, low and cautious, of a new generation of Camorra strategists calling themselves Gli Architetti. They don't deal in violence. They deal in frameworks. They avoid clubs, casinos, and turf wars. Instead, they use dormant e-commerce platforms, carbon credit exchanges, and cross-border refund frauds. All things Antonio predicted would be the new bloodless frontier. He didn't just change the game. He built a new one and handed out the rule book. Many people still think that Gli Architetti operate using blueprints Antonio left behind, stored on encrypted servers, accessed only through time-released keys. So what do you think? Legacy or live transmission? Meanwhile, in his cell, Antonio begins writing again. Not memoirs, not confessions, blueprints, or, more accurately, economic simulations. He constructs fictional city economies on paper, complete with tax loopholes, shell firm clusters, and population behavior modeling. He calculates how long it would take a ghost company to absorb a local council budget without triggering an audit. He's not planning a comeback. He's running thought experiments, like a scientist in exile. One day, a guard finds him drawing concentric circles in his notebook. When asked what it is, Antonio replies, "The ripple model, influence without proximity." The guard nods, doesn't ask again. Let's shift now to a seemingly minor incident in Lisbon, a flower shop. Quiet, charming, popular with tourists, gets audited. Nothing seems wrong. But a new bank compliance officer flags a payment pattern. Daily deposits, always rounded, never varying more than 1237s. He investigates. The shop owner insists it's regular tourism traffic, but deeper in the payment logs is a recurring transfer to a cleaning service in Rotterdam. The Rotterdam company lists its primary vendor as a Latvian marketing firm. The Latvian firm, owned in part by a Bulgarian shell whose founding address, get ready, is the same post office box once used by Atrium. One audit, 3 layers, same shadow. The flower shop is cleared. No crimes committed. But someone, somewhere, is still breathing through the straw Antonio built. Back in Milan's high-security facility, Antonio's routines don't change. He wakes at dawn, reads, writes, occasionally plays chess against himself. There's a rumor he once beat a visiting champion in 6 moves, using only pawn advances. The story is likely false, but it spreads fast. And strangely, Antonio never denies it. Even his silence plays strategy. At this point, law enforcement attempts something bold. They offer him leverage, testify in exchange for privileges. A monitored laptop, a few emails, maybe even controlled access to restricted databases for research purposes. Antonio listens, then asks, "Will I be allowed to correct the errors in your reports?" That's the closest he comes to mockery. They decline. He shrugs. This exchange becomes legend among officers. The man who, when offered a keyboard, asked to fact-check his own capture. Let's rewind for a moment. Do you remember the Perdopo note? The one they found in his farmhouse? It resurfaces in 2011 as part of a closed-door briefing because a cryptographer reviewing the handwriting notices something odd. The slant of the signature isn't natural. It matches a cipher from an old Camorra ledger encryption. When decoded, the note's final 3 words translate to, "Others already know." This spooks the analysts. Was Antonio signaling something? A broader circle? A succession plan? Or was he just seeding doubt? That question haunts investigators more than any spreadsheet. Meanwhile, across Europe, law enforcement agencies begin cooperating at new levels. Task forces are merged, AI systems deployed, databases synchronized, all to catch the phantom networks still operating under Antonio's style. But here's the twist. The more advanced the systems become, the more they resemble his. Every financial crimes unit now builds pattern recognition software that traces shell behavior, invoice loops, and ownership anomalies. Antonio didn't just outmaneuver enforcement. He trained it. He taught them to see. And that is legacy. Not buildings, not names, not headlines, but method. In 2012, an investigative journalist publishes a book titled "The Man Who Made Silence Profitable." It becomes a minor bestseller. One chapter theorizes that Antonio intentionally built self-replicating financial organisms, entities that adapt, evolve, and survive without a master. Another chapter suggests he's still communicating, not with words, but through behavior. Each time a known company under his design suddenly changes policy, donating to a school, pausing dividends, opening new branches in politically unstable zones, theorists call it a pulse, and every pulse sends analysts into a frenzy. Many people still think Antonio left behind trigger mechanisms, actions that, once detected, confirm he's still pulling strings. So, what do you think? Evidence or paranoia dressed in code? Regardless of what's true, one thing remains. Even locked away, Antonio Iovine continues to shape the contours of invisible empires. By the summer of 2012, the name Antonio Iovine no longer appears on arrest warrants or breaking news headlines, but it does start showing up, quietly, subtly, in white papers, economic roundtables, and internal compliance memos across Europe. He's not mentioned as a criminal. He's cited as a case study, a phenomenon, an early signal of how modern financial ecosystems can be manipulated not through brute force, but through elegance, subtlety, the precise, pressureless erosion of regulatory assumptions. In Geneva, a private bank hosts an invitation-only panel on emerging threats in structured finance. One of the speakers, a former fraud detection officer, walks the audience through a simulated case, fictional, of course. A multinational logistics firm backed by Shell partnerships, with no identifiable CEO, yet pulling in consistent profits and passing every audit. He concludes the presentation with a single line. If this sounds familiar, it should. The slide behind him shows only 2 words: Iovine style. Meanwhile, in prison, Antonio is quietly reassigned to a different wing. The reasoning? Over-engagement. His presence in the former unit had created a ripple. Not chaos, never chaos, but a kind of gravitational field where other inmates began forming consultation queues. Not for advice, for approval. They'd draft letters, draw business plans, sketch property deals, and wait to see if Antonio's eyes flicked toward them. He never said yes, never said no. But the inmates knew when to proceed. They could feel it. So now, he's placed in solitary rotation. No consistent neighbors, fewer materials, limited news access. Still, the guards notice something strange. His requests for paper never change in quantity. Every week, he receives the same amount. Every week, he uses every sheet. But his notebooks remain half empty. Where do the rest of the pages go? A routine cell sweep offers no clues, no smuggled devices, no code books. Just a single phrase penciled neatly on a scrap near his cot. The map is not the territory, a nod to Alfred Korzybski, a philosopher of semantics, or maybe just another dead end. Do you remember the theory about pulses? Those subtle changes in old Iovine-linked businesses believed to signal activity? Well, in 2012, a cluster of them goes off within the span of 3 weeks. A dormant charity in Lyon reactivates and donates $40,000 to a Tunisian infrastructure fund. A warehouse company in Antwerp launches a side business in data archiving, despite never owning computers. A ghost foundation in Romania receives a single incoming transfer from a bank in Sao Paulo, then disappears, individually meaningless. Collectively familiar? Investigators huddle. Algorithms are fed, correlations teased out. And the pattern they discover? Every entity activated was once linked, faintly, to Atrium's subsidiaries. It's not proof, but it's rhythm. And the rhythm is very Antonio. Many people still think that Antonio embedded automated triggers into his system, based on time, external events, or pre-programmed thresholds. So what do you think? Are these echoes or orchestrations? Within the anti-mafia division in Naples, skepticism grows. Some younger officers begin to believe Antonio's true gift wasn't money laundering. It was narrative laundering. He didn't just bury wealth. He buried intention. Everything he built could be seen 2 ways: clean or dirty, legitimate or manipulative, depending on how you squinted. One agent even writes in an internal report, "His legacy isn't financial, it's epistemological. He made doubt profitable." Let's pull the lens wider for a moment. In 2013, a European think tank publishes a study on decentralized criminal networks. The conclusion is bold. Future criminal entities will not behave like pyramids or webs. They will behave like code, modular, context-reactive, and without memory. In the footnotes, a single mention. See also Iovine Framework Hypothesis. That term, Iovine Framework, catches on. Suddenly, you have graduate students writing theses on leaderless capital streams. Cryptocurrency analysts tracing coin flows and naming certain chain behaviors, type Iovine. Even a short-lived blockchain security startup brands itself IovineSec before being pressured to rebrand. And yet, Antonio never says a word about it, never reacts, never claims, never denies. In his world, silence has always been the loudest response. But prison can't hold out the world forever. In late 2013, something breaks the monotony. A letter, handwritten, on thick foreign stationery, delivered through diplomatic mail, though no embassy claims it. Inside, there's no message, just a photocopy of a deed transfer. The deed to a property in rural Vietnam, an abandoned silk factory, now registered to a holding company called YVNI Holdings. Read it backward. Ivany. IVNI. Iovine. Coincidence? The authorities don't think so. They scramble. Try to trace the firm. Nothing. It was established 8 months prior, funded via crypto wallets already inactive. The property exists, but local officials report it sits unused, just dust and locks. But when Italian investigators request access, the Vietnamese office declines. The holding company's papers are in order. No violations. no reasons to disturb it. And Antonio? When shown the photocopy, he smiles. A small, quiet smile. Not of pride, not of confession, just acknowledgement. Then he folds the paper into quarters, hands it back, and says, "That's outside your jurisdiction." It's the first sentence he's spoken in over a year. That moment becomes legend. Do you remember the courier? The one caught at the Brenner Pass? All those years ago? Turns out, he's alive, living in a suburb outside Rome. Clean record. 2 kids. Works for a sanitation company. When asked recently if he still thinks about Antonio, he says, "Every time I sort numbers, he taught me to balance things I didn't even know I was carrying." Maybe that's the real trick. Antonio didn't teach crime. He taught calm, stillness, invisibility, and how to build systems so quiet, so functional, that they start to look like they were never built at all. By 2014, the myth of Antonio Iovine has evolved beyond the boundaries of organized crime. He's no longer discussed only in courtrooms or police reports. He's now referenced in university lectures, startup pitches, and cybersecurity conferences. In a seminar at Bocconi University in Milan, a professor presents a slide titled "System Resilience Without Central Authority, the Iovine Model." The audience is a mix of economics majors and political science students, none of whom are old enough to remember Antonio's prime years. But they know the outline of the story, the ghost, the ledger trails, the business networks that behaved like coral reefs, alive, regenerative, hidden in plain sight. What they don't know, what no one truly knows, is whether Antonio's silence is strategy or surrender. In prison, he's now into his 4th year of custody. He hasn't appealed his sentence. He hasn't asked for release. He hasn't changed his routine. Morning stretches, sparse meals, international news clippings, annotated with faint pencil marks, diagrams, hypotheticals, more notebooks, filled now with organizational trees that don't correspond to any real firm, but read like predictive models for future financial ecosystems. And that's when the whispers begin. Not about his past, about his future. A former financial regulator in Paris gives a quiet interview off the record. She says her office received a series of encrypted emails sent through a proxy account once linked to a now-defunct Cypriot art gallery. The content? A proposal for an automated compliance system that monitors financial flows, flags potential laundering triggers before they escalate, and routes them through human review panels. The system works, on paper at least, too well, too clean. When traced backward, the system's code shows one curious tag in its metadata. Framework. 1, V, and 3, IVINE. Modified, masked, but unmistakable. If true, this means Antonio isn't just remembered. He's adapting from inside. Many people still think Antonio used his prison time not as penance, but as planning. That he saw incarceration not as an ending, but as insulation from both law enforcement and internal betrayal. So what do you think? Did he step into the shadows to write a brighter design? Meanwhile, outside the prison, small reverberations continue. In Dublin, a mid-level compliance officer at a fintech firm notices an odd account behavior. A customer repeatedly deposits and withdraws the same amounts, always on Thursdays, always in 3 currencies. When reviewed, the account shows no criminal flags, but the pattern matches a historical case. A payment echo first seen in an old Iovine-linked property scheme in Naples. No law broken, no transaction illegal. But it's like watching a fingerprint form. Out of light. Back in Italy, Antonio receives a visitor. Not a lawyer, not family, an economist from Turin. She's working on a study about invisible influence structures and requests a 30-minute interview. To everyone's surprise, Antonio agrees, on one condition. She brings no notes, no pen, no recorder. She accepts. What is said during that conversation remains a mystery. But after she leaves, she writes in her journal, "He spoke of entropy as a form of design, of control through non-interference, of economies as weather systems, measurable, but never truly predictable." She concludes, "He doesn't see himself as a criminal. He sees himself as proof. Proof of what? She doesn't say, but it leaves investigators uneasy, because while Antonio remains physically static, his designs seem to evolve, organically, intelligently, even playfully. Let's revisit the prison for a moment. His behavior remains impeccable, but the guards begin to notice something odd in his chess matches. He plays both sides, as always. No surprise there. But in one game, he sets the black king in the center of the board, then proceeds to surround it with pawns. Not to trap it, to shield it. The white pieces advance but never touch the king. The game ends with the board frozen, balanced. No victory, no defeat. When asked about it, he smiles and replies, "Stalemate is underrated." This moment becomes an internal reference for investigators. They begin calling certain shell formations stalemate structures, designed not to grow or hide money, but simply to exist, quietly, waiting. And while they continue their tracing work, other names start surfacing. Laurenti Maritime in Lisbon, Camorra Holdings in the Seychelles, Bolitas Foundation in Bogota. Different industries, different continents, same strange patterns, revolving ownership, minimal profits, but exceptionally tidy paperwork. No crime committed, just presence. Do you remember the letter from Vietnam? The silk factory deed? It remains untouched, still owned by YVNI Holdings, still tax compliant, still generating no revenue. But in 2014, a courier delivers a single package to the Italian consulate in Ho Chi Minh City. No return address. Inside, a bottle of Italian red wine, no label, no note, just a cork with the initials AI burned into the top. The consulate reports it. Authorities log it. And Antonio, when asked if he sent it, simply shrugs. That shrug becomes a symbol. Across encrypted chat rooms, in forums used by dark money operatives and gray market consultants, a new phrase emerges. Send the bottle, meaning, deliver the message, leave no trail, let the silence speak. It's not clear if Antonio coined it, or if the world did it for him. But either way, his story has now breached its own reality. He's gone from man to metaphor. Even the anti-mafia task force begins to accept this new truth. Antonio Iovine may never leave prison, but the world he built, it's still building. By 2015, Italy's Financial Crimes Division begins referring to certain lingering networks as Iovine residuals, not formally, not in court filings, but internally, in memos and task force briefings. The term takes hold. It's shorthand for entities that don't seem criminal, yet behave like they were built by someone who never intended to explain them. These residuals aren't just businesses. They're patterns, behaviors, echoes of a vanished orchestration style, perfect balance sheets, rotating board structures, just enough legitimacy to avoid disruption, and a quiet aura of intentional invisibility. And when they pop up, whether in Denmark, in Uruguay, or along the outer banking corridors of Dubai, one question lingers in the room. Is this another bottle? Back in prison, Antonio Iovine remains unchanged, a man deeply still. He walks, he reads, he folds, he listens. And what unnerves even the most seasoned wardens isn't what he says, it's what he doesn't. There's no arrogance, no denial, no flair. Just a patient, measured absorption of time, as if he's converting it into something else, slowly, deliberately, internally. One psychologist visits the facility, assigned to assess long-term cognitive patterns in high-control personalities. She meets Antonio once. Her report is concise. He does not resist the system. He watches it until it resists itself. But resistance is not what authorities are encountering. Instead, they face adaptation. One example. A fintech startup in Tallinn, Estonia, begins offering compliance shielding as a service. On the surface, it's a clever tool for startups trying to navigate pan-European tax regulations. But beneath it, familiar code structure. A rhythm in the transaction monitoring software that mirrors legacy Iovine data pipelines. The founders? Former interns from a defunct Swiss law office that once represented a company whose only known shareholder was an offshore entity tied to, yes, Atrium Investments. Nothing illegal, nothing direct, just tonal echoes. That phrase becomes popular too. Tonal echoes, meaning no proof, just presence. And that presence begins to grow. In São Paulo, a luxury flower delivery service expands rapidly. Each bouquet comes with QR codes for sentiment tracking. When scanned, they lead to donation pages for obscure nonprofits. Nonprofits that, after forensic tracing, are linked to other nonprofits that, in turn, disappear quietly into trust structures in Gibraltar. All of them legal, all of them active, none of them criminal. But if you look at the flow as music, it sounds familiar. Do you remember the concentric circles Antonio drew? The ripple model? Investigators start using that framework to model the spread, not just of funds, but of style. One law enforcement agent, exasperated, says, "We're chasing watermarks, not operations, because what Antonio left behind is no longer a system. It's an aesthetic, a kind of financial elegance that even new players unknowingly imitate." Back inside, Antonio receives a surprising piece of news. A university in Berlin includes a unit on shadow economics in their MBA program. One entire lecture is titled, "The Iovine Paradox, Control Without Ownership." Someone mails him the syllabus. He laughs for the first time in months. That same week, an inmate approaches him during the yard hour. Younger, excitable, eager. He wants advice, wants to build something. A new chain of construction firms, all legal, all above board. He just wants it to be bulletproof. Antonio doesn't respond. He just looks at the young man for a moment and says, "You're already thinking like a criminal." The inmate never asks again. Many people still think Antonio has been quietly curating a new model from within prison. Not through notes or code, but through ideas planted in others. So what do you think? Is he still building? Or just watching what's already grown? Elsewhere in Naples, a journalist uncovers a forgotten property deed. A bakery once owned by a defunct grocery cooperative that had, for 2 years, reported zero revenue, but employed 3 full-time staff. The last filed report, signed by a lawyer based in Singapore, an office that closed in 2011. The bakery? Now a florist. The staff? Gone. But the security camera on the corner still works. Still wired to a server in Brussels. Still active. No one knows why. Meanwhile, a string of anonymous donations appear in central Italy, targeted to libraries, trade schools, municipal beautification projects. Each gift comes through a new foundation. Each foundation disappears 6 months later. Investigators trace the trail backward, 1 link, then 2, and find a shared notary, a woman in her 70s, retired, who once handled shipping documents for a certain tomato farm in Casal di Principe. When asked if she remembers the name Antonio Iovine, she replies, "Never met him. But once, I saw a man standing very still near the ledger books. Didn't say a word, just listened. Back in his cell, Antonio has taken to sketching floor plans, not of buildings, but of spaces, open spaces, absences, rooms that connect only through blind corners with no labels. One guard peeks over and asks, "What are these?" Antonio doesn't look up, just mutters, "Places no one thinks to watch." The notebook is left behind when he sleeps. A researcher later finds that one of the layouts matches, almost exactly, the structural design of a decommissioned NATO communication bunker sold in 2009 to a Belgian telecom company, which now sits empty, leased to a holding group under dormant status. The group's name? Cordaro Partners. The founder? Unknown. But the registration signature, when run through handwriting analysis, returns a 78% match to an old shipping manifest signed once by a logistics clerk at Atrium. It never ends, and maybe that's the point, because what Antonio Iovine built isn't a crime to be unraveled. It's a language that keeps writing itself, even as the speaker sleeps. It is now early 2016. Antonio Iovine has been in prison for nearly 6 years, and yet, impossibly, unreasonably, his presence feels more ambient, more entrenched than when he was free. Not just in Naples, but in Zurich, in Bogota, in Dakar, in places where money changes hands faster than names change meaning. The Iovine residuals, as investigators now reluctantly call them, have begun to evolve. Where once they mimicked his methods, now they appear to anticipate reactions. Shell companies open and dissolve on fiscal calendar cycles. Contract routing shifts quarterly. Even donation patterns follow election cycles in regions far from southern Italy. It's as if a ghost algorithm is running on clockwork, one designed not merely to avoid detection, but to preempt the logic of enforcement. And through all of this, Antonio, ever the minimalist, remains still. No protests, no statements, not even a glance toward clemency. But something changes, not in him, in the walls. For the first time since his arrest, the system around Antonio begins to crack under its own weight. Not from internal corruption, but from fatigue. The task forces are burned out. International cooperation, once fierce and hungry, is now brittle and bureaucratic. Analysts are rotated, leads go cold, and in high-level meetings, you start to hear a different kind of resignation. He won, maybe not personally, but structurally. In fact, a senior EU commissioner is quoted as saying, "If what we're dealing with now is Iovine 2.0, then we were only ever chasing the beta version." Let's shift to a curious development in Nairobi. A property development company, small, discreet, begins acquiring idle lots on the outskirts of the city. Each purchase is clean, local, registered, but two things stand out. All transfers are done through a Lisbon legal firm once linked to Atrium's maritime logistics wing. Every lot is immediately leased to a non-profit specializing in urban beekeeping. No violations, no suspicions, just improbable business logic. A field agent jokes, either Antonio started a honey empire, or someone's using insects as cover for bandwidth. They test it. One hive unit, smuggled back to Italy, contains a microchip buried under the base. Encrypted, passive, but holding the access logins to a web of low-tier cryptocurrency wallets, all dormant, all dated back to 2008. They bring the chip to Antonio's cell, slide it across the table. He stares at it, then whispers, "Bees don't gossip." It's the first voluntary sentence he's spoken in over a year. No follow-up, just silence. Many people still think that Antonio's legacy includes physical trigger objects, simple items that activate or archive access to long-dormant data routes. So what do you think? Did he build a future in fragments, disguised as pollinators? Meanwhile, the legend spreads to places where the law doesn't reach easily. In Paraguay, a banker references Iovine compliance to explain why his firm maintains 6 layers of obfuscation around client funds. In Bucharest, A startup founder says he models his holdings on fog theory, a nod to the algorithm della nebbia Antonio once described in a confiscated notebook. In Boston, a group of graduate students release an academic paper titled Neutral Structures in Illicit Resilience, Lessons from the Iovine Epoch. It's downloaded over 80,000 times, and still, he sleeps. In his cell, Antonio has taken to meditating. 10 minutes every afternoon. Legs crossed, eyes shut, hands folded like an auditor's. The guards joke that he's recalculating the weather, or maybe just listening for systems he no longer needs to direct, because that's the growing theory now, not that Antonio is operating from within, but that his systems have exited him, that they no longer need his breath to function, that somewhere in the quiet coordination of dull companies with perfect tax returns, a new organism has formed, one that Antonio merely planted, and which now prunes itself. A hydra, yes, but one that trims its own heads for balance, and maybe that's why he isn't trying to escape, why he never once filed for early release. Because maybe, just maybe, he already left. Not physically, structurally. Do you remember the chessboard with the pawns protecting the king? The frozen endgame? Well, one guard, curious, returns to Antonio's old drawings from that year. He notices something subtle. In one version, the Black King is gone. The pawns remain, still guarding the center, but there's nothing in the middle. No peace, just silence, just shape, like a shadow with no source. He shows the diagram to a prison psychologist who offers a chilling interpretation. He taught the pieces to defend a position, even after the player walked away. In the outside world, former associates continue to vanish, not in death, but in disappearance, retirements, migrations, a quiet fade. No one sells anyone out, no one claims leadership, and no new name replaces Antonio's, because there is no need for one. The system does not replace the architect, it simply moves on. Now, before we drift into the next part of the journey, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders fall just a bit heavier against the pillow. The light is low, the air still. The pace slows. The weight of the past hour fades like fog into forest. You followed Antonio Iovine through shadows, silence, and systems so clean they echo in empty rooms. Now, let your thoughts soften, let questions settle. Not everything needs resolution. Some stories, like Antonio's, were never meant to end, just designed to continue. Quietly. You're safe here. The system can't follow, and neither can he. Just the soft hum of your breath now, like bees, buzzing quietly somewhere far away. Sleep well, listener. Spring 2016. Antonio Iovine, once the most hunted financial strategist of the Camorra, now spends his days pacing a rectangular courtyard beneath Naples' pale sun. His steps are slow, deliberate, like he's still measuring distances in ledgers, not footsteps. He walks alone, as always, 2 meters from the garden wall, 3 meters from the rusted bench. If a drone hovered overhead, it might look like a man drawing geometry into dust. Inside the prison, there's a term whispered by staff and inmates alike. The hollow vault. It doesn't refer to a cell. It refers to him, a man who contains 1,000 vaults inside his silence, but gives no key. A man who seems perfectly content knowing the world still turns on mechanisms he set in motion, even if no one knows which ones anymore. But far beyond these walls, something else is turning. You see, there's a shift happening in how criminal networks think. In Eastern Europe, mid-tier laundering rings are being dismantled, not because of enforcement, but because of redundancy. Their methods, now inefficient, are quietly replaced by structures that look suspiciously Iovine-like, not copied, evolved. In Berlin, an intelligence analyst maps out 3 overlapping companies across Serbia, Spain, and the UAE. Different names, different sectors, but they report revenue spikes within 3 days of each other. Every quarter. Exactly. That can't be accident. She cross-references the payment flow. It loops once through a Turkish shipping exchange before evaporating into a Danish data server, one previously owned by a dissolved entity linked to Koval AG, an obscure firm whose original paperwork included an internal code once used by an Atrium freight subsidiary in 2007. Still no crime, still no names, just rhythm. And rhythm, as they now understand, is harder to fake than paperwork. One Europol official comments, "He didn't leave us fingerprints, he left us tempo." Back in Milan's high-security wing, Antonio now receives fewer visits. His lawyer comes once a month, brings books, newspapers, a magazine or two. But Antonio reads less now. He spends more time listening, to the guards' boots, to the wind in the vents, to the shouts from other units. It's as if he's trying to hear something outside, or waiting for the next move that he didn't design. Because here's what's really troubling investigators. Some structures attributed to the Iovine residuals are behaving creatively, opening bank accounts in jurisdictions Antonio never touched, moving assets into blockchain contracts with syntax he never used, responding to new regulations in real time. In other words, the system is learning. Could it be that his network has become self-correcting? Many people still think Antonio anticipated this, that he intentionally designed a system capable of drift evolution, autonomously adjusting behavior while maintaining core logic. So what do you think? Can a man's methods become more alive after he stops using them? Let's visit a moment that chills the core. A routine audit in Zurich flags an unusual transfer from a minor shipping firm in Chile to a defunct Swedish NGO. The NGO has no bank account. The funds were returned, but the wire request was issued automatically by software based on a recurring calendar event. March 7th, 10:15 a.m. CET. That date and time match a minor political assassination in Naples from 2001. A killing that many believe, to this day, indirectly led to Antonio's rise within the Casalese syndicate. No one can explain the connection, but someone wanted that timestamp to echo. Whether as tribute, trigger, or misdirection, no one knows. Meanwhile, Antonio's routines tighten. He folds his laundry into squares, cuts his apples into eighths, times his showers to 4 minutes. He's not compulsive. He's measuring something. Always measuring. A psychologist tries to engage him, asking what he misses most about freedom. Antonio replies, "It's easier to observe entropy when you're not part of it, and that's the key, isn't it?" He doesn't see himself as caught. He sees himself as outside the cycle now. Let's take a quick detour to Montenegro. A quiet bank there, Luna Nova Holdings, launches a new internal auditing protocol. It's unusually sophisticated, uses layered flagging, AI pattern mirroring, and something called dark logic correction, which no one in the industry recognizes until a junior analyst finds a footnote buried in the implementation guide, DLC module inspired by fog loop compensation modeling, paper 3A IVN. Iovine. It's not even hidden anymore. It's just accepted. His name has become a methodological footnote. Back in Naples, a mid-level crime syndicate makes a strange move. They self-dissolve publicly, file paperwork, pay their taxes, claim to move away from criminal activity permanently. Investigators wait for the trap, but it never comes. Instead, the syndicate's properties begin generating real income. Bookkeeping improves. Even the restaurants start turning profits, actual ones. An economic sociologist proposes a theory. They didn't retire. They evolved. They adopted the Iovine model fully. And then there's the letter, delivered to a retired banker in Milan. No return address. Just a short sentence, typed on old carbon paper. The cleanest exit is transformation. No one claims authorship. The banker brings it to the authorities. When they show it to Antonio, he reads it, doesn't blink, then says, "Entropy again." It folds into order. Many people still think Antonio isn't just fading. He's orchestrating his own irrelevance. So what do you think? Is this the final move of a mastermind to vanish not just in body, but in function? Do you remember the flower shop in Lisbon? It closed this year, but before shutting down, it processed one last payment. $200 to a ceramic artist in Morocco. The ceramicist's signature glaze pattern? Hexagonal ripples, concentric, balanced. He calls it La Nebbia, the fog. And so, the story continues, not in footsteps or headlines, but in transactions, forms, shapes, not in the voice of the man, but in the systems he taught the world to hum. Spring drifts into summer 2016. In most prisons, time feels slow, thick, stalled, stretched across gray walls. But in Antonio Iovine's world, time is still a variable, something to be bent, shaped, calculated. To anyone else, he is doing nothing, yet those who observe him closely know he's doing everything. Every movement, every pause is logged mentally, as if each hour were a digit in an equation. Some believe he's waiting, others believe he's guiding, but not with his hands, with gravity, because outside the prison gates, gravity is shifting again. In the Netherlands, a former mid-level tax consultant opens a boutique agency promising to optimize gray funds. It operates under the name Valaro Consult, files perfect quarterly reports, pays its dues, and offers zero transparency beyond the legal minimum. When asked about their methodology, their site simply says, "We believe in nebbia architecture, fog architecture." An investigator raises the alarm, cross-referencing the term. The same phrase appears in a confiscated notebook from Antonio's villa, dated 2006. And what's more curious? The consultant behind Valaro once worked for a now-defunct firm that handled insurance portfolios for Atrium Investments' Baltic assets. It's not proof, it's resonance. That's what the world is now chasing. Not fingerprints, not invoices, not confessions, just resonance. Systems that hum in the same low tone that Antonio once breathed. Meanwhile, in prison, Antonio is quiet as ever. But a new habit forms. He begins tracing maps. Not of cities, not of continents, but networks. He draws them with no labels, just lines and distances, nodal points, loops. Some resemble metro systems. Others look like constellation charts. One resembles the nerve system of a jellyfish, another the route of cargo ships across the Atlantic. A warden, curious, asks what they are. Antonio replies, "I'm modeling choices." The warden doesn't ask again. "Do you remember the chessboard?" This month, Antonio stops playing it. He moves on to Go, the ancient Chinese game of territory, subtlety, and absorption, rather than confrontation. He plays both sides, as before. But with Go, the game feels different. Larger, looser, less about king and conquest, more about encirclement, influence, and patience. When an inmate asks what he prefers about Go, Antonio simply says, "Control doesn't need a crown." In Brussels, an EU Anti-Financial Crimes Committee hosts an off-the-record session titled Post-Leadership Networks, the Case of Iovine. Their conclusion is alarming. We are not dealing with an individual anymore. We are dealing with a behavior model, one capable of outliving its designer. In other words, Antonio is no longer relevant, because the logic he created now sustains itself. And that idea unsettles even the most seasoned bureaucrats, not because it's illegal, but because it's elegant. Let's shift to Southeast Asia. A Cambodian fishing company, Bay Red LLC, begins receiving high-volume equipment orders from 3 different European buyers. All orders are paid in advance, all routed through a Hong Kong middleman. But when shipments are examined, the products are real. Nets, boat motors, safety gear, nothing suspicious, until a Dutch analyst discovers that the payment cycles form a Fibonacci sequence. Every third transaction loops through a Liechtenstein trust, previously used by a now-dissolved seafood venture once linked to a Portuguese exporter, formerly owned by a shell of Atrium's third-tier consortiums. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Antonio's math is still out there, ticking quietly like a watch buried under sand. Many people still think that Antonio's systems weren't just designed to run autonomously, but to evolve when threatened. So what do you think? Did he build defense mechanisms or evolutionary instincts? Let's return to the prison. A new psychologist is assigned to observe him. She sits with him weekly, not to interrogate, just to talk. They discuss entropy, decay, coral reefs, fractal repetition. In one session, she asks him about legacy. His reply, "I never wanted to be remembered, just reused." That phrase, "just reused," becomes a quiet thesis in certain intelligence circles. A CIA analyst drafts an internal paper titled Iovine as an Operational Template, The Death of the Criminal Ego. Its opening line, "He may be the first true anti-celebrity criminal, a designer, not a dictator, an architect of plausible silence." And in Naples, this silence is beginning to matter. Young criminal outfits, splinter groups once obsessed with flamboyant displays, with social media bravado and petty turf wars, begin shifting their tone. They wear suits again. They study finance. They whisper about Iovine not as a ghost, but as a discipline. Some form think tanks. Others invest in agricultural tech. One gang is rumored to have hired a retired UN compliance officer to build them a corporate shell complex. Do you remember the tomato farm? Its land, once seized, was resold twice. The current owner is a Dutch-registered environmental foundation specializing in soil rejuvenation. But the board of that foundation includes a logistics consultant who formerly worked for Cordaro Partners, the telecom shell from Belgium. The same pattern again. A new node, same hum. And Antonio? He listens. When a news clipping about the soil rejuvenation company is slipped under his door, he chuckles, then folds it into a triangle, puts it under his pillow, says nothing. Later, when asked by a guard whether he's proud, he only replies, "It's not about pride, it's about posture." Many people still think that Antonio's endgame is neither escape nor exoneration, but dilution. To fade into the systems he designed until he's indistinguishable from them. So what do you think? Can a man truly vanish? By teaching others how to stop needing him? By the final quarter of 2016, Antonio Iovine is no longer referenced in the present tense. His name no longer elicits active manhunts or courtroom anticipation. He is not discussed as a fugitive, nor as a mastermind still pulling strings. Instead, he is spoken of in the way mathematicians reference a theorem: understood, proven, rarely improved upon. In Naples, there's even a joke among mid-level Camorra crews. If your plan has to be explained, it's not Iovine. But what's happening now isn't just imitation. It's institutionalization. Let's look at Moldova. A new consultancy opens, Axis Fog Limited. It specializes in cross-border optimization through non-contiguous asset planning. That's bureaucratic nonsense for moving money without moving it. The company's website features diagrams of ecosystems, not financial charts. One shows a tree, its roots mirrored above ground like branches. Another shows raindrops bouncing from leaf to leaf, labeled as transactional moments. Buried in the site's HTML is a comment tag. No attribution, just that no crime can be proven. The company exists, files taxes, operates with quiet precision. Sound familiar? Meanwhile, in Luxembourg, a compliance officer stumbles on a pattern. 7 small firms dissolved within 3 months, each leaving behind exactly 4,000 in untapped accounts. 4 fours. Not suspicious, except to those who know Antonio's pattern fixation. He once scribbled in a margin, 4 is stable, 4 repeats, 4 never forgets. The phrase now haunts forensic audits. Even if coincidental, the investigators have begun tracking numerical ghosts. Configurations so specific they feel like signatures without ink. Back inside Milan's prison, Antonio continues to draw. His latest works look like networks in collapse. Nodes retreating, lines thinning, clusters dispersing. He isn't drawing power. He's drawing dissolution. Not chaos, but diffusion. One guard asks, "What happens when the web breaks?" Antonio's reply? It stops needing to. This concept, intentional dispersal, has now made its way into academic finance. A Paris business school publishes a case study titled The Iovine Dispersal Hypothesis, Scaling Down to Survive. The study suggests that Antonio's true innovation wasn't centralization. It was the ability to design systems where every piece could operate independently, as if each cell remembered the whole body. Think of it like the starfish model. Cut one limb, it grows back. Remove the head, there isn't one. And this model is now popping up where you'd least expect. In Haiti, a small NGO running microloans is discovered funneling portions of interest repayments through 4 untraceable intermediaries. All funds are accounted for, but the routing is inexplicably complex. When traced, 2 of the intermediary holding firms were once managed by accountants who formerly worked for a Neapolitan seafood consortium. Another firm once folded into the old Atrium Investments network. And so it continues. No clear crime, just design bleed. The fingerprint of a system that no longer needs its maker. Many people still think that Antonio seeded this bleed deliberately, that he wanted his logic to spill into banks, non-profits, legitimate structures, until no one could separate criminal architecture from systemic innovation. So what do you think? Did he pollute the system, or merely prove it was always porous? Do you remember the silk factory in Vietnam? YVNI Holdings? In October, a single-page newsletter is published by a logistics startup in Singapore. It announces a strategic partnership with a Vietnamese textile firm for high-trust corridor modeling. The textile firm, founded in 2012, dormant, then suddenly active. Its new name? Iovine Logistics. No explanation, no announcement. The only clue? A tagline in small print. Balance over volume, fog over walls. Back in Milan, Antonio receives a package. Legal. Cleared. Contained a book on deep-sea coral structures. Inside is a note. Not typed, not handwritten. Just a line printed using an old dot matrix printer. Corals build without knowing. Yet they outlive hurricanes. He folds the paper, smiles. That same week, for the first time in years, Antonio submits a formal request. He wants a copy of Plato's Phaedrus, not a modern edition, one with marginal notes. No reason given, but a few days after receiving it, he's seen writing something new. Not diagrams, not flowcharts. He's composing short phrases, each phrase written only once, no edits, no rewrites. Some examples. The cleanest shadow belongs to no wall. Let the architecture forget your face. Quiet systems hum longer than loud kings. A guard collects the notes, passes them to the prison's legal department. They don't know what to file them under. Poetry, confession, blueprint. Later, when one of the guards asks him what the notes are, Antonio says, "Not instructions, just reminders." Then he stands, stretches his arms, and walks to the window. The view? A gray courtyard, empty. But in his eyes, you'd think he was watching waves. And now, listener, let your breath fall into pattern. Let the rhythm of this story, slow, constant, inevitable, carry you just a little deeper. You've followed the ghost banker from balance sheets to metaphor, from espresso slips to echoing flowers, from quiet to something more profound than silence. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. And if you're still here with me, Let this be your moment of stillness, because the systems outside, they'll hum without us. The names will fade, but the patterns, they remember. Sleep now, not because it's over, but because some stories, like fog, don't end. They just drift. It's late 2016. Antonio Iovine, now 6 years into his incarceration, has become the calmest person in any room, by far. He exists like a comma in the middle of a long sentence, pausing everything around him without changing its direction. Inmates shift their tone when passing his cell. Guards walk softer on the tiles nearby. Even the warden has started referring to him as Il Centro, the center, and yet Antonio says almost nothing. In fact, the last recorded time he initiated a conversation was 3 weeks ago, when he asked for a second copy of the same newspaper. When handed the duplicate, he gently removed a page, folded it 4 times, and slid it under the leg of a crooked chair in the communal area. That was it. Even his interventions are stabilizers, but outside, his silence is no longer trusted. Because the system he left behind? It's mutating. Again. Let's talk about Triband Modular, a clean energy logistics firm registered in Cyprus. It appears legitimate. 3 directors, audited quarterly, consistent revenue from supplying battery containers to coastal towns in North Africa, until someone notices its transport insurance provider shares a back office address with a dormant shell from 2009. That shell once received payment for consulting from a Latvian port authority 3 months after the authority signed a contract with Atrium Maritime Logistics. Another hum, another fog drift. But what makes Triband particularly suspicious is its feedback loop, an internal system that reroutes revenue surges through charitable environmental offsetting, then channels tax rebate capital into passive income trusts that re-enter the firm as contractual reinvestment. The entire cycle? 11 weeks. Exactly. Antonio once wrote in a seized ledger, 11 weeks to breathe in, 11 to exhale. Coincidence? By now no one thinks so. Many people still think Triband is part of a second-generation Iovine structure, not built by him, but by someone who understood his philosophy: distance, rhythm, concealment through function. So what do you think? Has Antonio created disciples, or just proven that genius can be mimicked if you leave enough blueprints behind? Meanwhile, in his cell, Antonio begins to paint. Watercolors. Soft, muted tones, mostly abstract. He favors fog, branches, empty bridges. One piece shows 5 doors, each ajar, each casting identical shadows despite different light angles. A guard, curious, asks about it. Antonio says, sometimes the best exit isn't chosen, it's prepared. That painting vanishes a week later. No record of who took it. No complaint filed. The empty canvas sits quietly in the same place. And then a real-world consequence arrives. A scandal breaks in a mid-sized Spanish logistics company, Cuerpo Atlántico S.A. A data leak reveals they've been running a double-booked invoicing scheme using Dutch routing companies. No violence, no threats, just math. The most damning detail. One of the code routines used to trigger false reporting matches a software module seized from Antonio's server back in 2010. Not copied, lifted, line for line. That software should have been under lock. It wasn't. So either someone stole it, or someone inside released it. And when Antonio is asked, he shrugs, says, if you bury seeds in concrete, eventually the cracks show where they reach the sun. This shrugging indifference is what unsettles the authorities most. He's not resisting. He's not confessing. He's simply acknowledging, which is what makes what happens next even more surreal. A foundation appears in Montreal, Fondazione di Marea. On the surface, it's a cultural center celebrating Italo-Canadian heritage. But when donations start rolling in, auditors flag something strange. All contributions are made in cash, physical, all in amounts just below Canadian threshold limits, all deposited with meticulous spacing, one every 33 hours. Investigators find the foundation rents a building once owned by a shell company under a Dutch trust, previously dissolved. The trust manager, retired. The address, empty. The building, filled with books. All finance, all law, all in Italian. A single quote is painted above the door. La vera potenza è quella che non ha bisogno di voltarsi. True power never needs to turn around. The building is legal, the money is legal, but it feels like a message. And when a Naples journalist writes a column titled The Cathedrals of Fog, referencing these hollow structures, he closes with the line, Iovine never left. He just broke himself into echoes. In prison, someone reads that column aloud to Antonio. He doesn't respond, but he lifts his pen and draws 3 concentric circles, then blacks out the center. Later that night, during bed check, his cell is silent, but his pillow is torn slightly at one seam. Inside, stitched in thread barely visible against the fabric, is a word, velare, Italian for veil, also a nautical command, and poetically, to obscure. Many people still think that Antonio has never stopped building, that his silence is not a void, but a perimeter. So what do you think? Is this the final defense of the invisible empire, or the slow drift of its final notes? And do you remember the game of Go? Antonio stops playing. Now he just sets up boards, mid-game, incomplete, as if someone else is meant to arrive, sit across from him, and finish the match. But no one comes, because perhaps the other player was always the system itself. By the dawn of 2017, something has quietly reversed. For years, the world chased Antonio Iovine, his movements, his patterns, his presumed commands. Every accountant he once spoke to, every envelope his name might have touched, was inspected, cataloged, interrogated. But now the pattern chases them. Investigators start to feel it. Not just watching for Iovine's ghost, but being watched by the ghost itself. Not paranoia, something subtler, something colder. For instance, an Italian financial investigator in Rome finds a manila envelope slipped under his door. No return address. Inside, a portfolio evaluation of a Brazilian shell company he had just begun investigating. The valuation? Accurate. Updated to the previous day. With a sticky note attached. Check the freight index from Porto de Santos, page 4. He follows the trail, discovers a network of deferred ownerships that use bonded cargo rotations to conceal microloans. None of it breaks laws outright, but every single pathway, down to the last shelf company, loops into a pattern Iovine once outlined in a seized draft titled Dual Value Trust Staggering. This isn't just legacy, this is response. Back in Milan's prison, Antonio says nothing, as always. But his behavior shifts again. His paintings stop. His walks shorten. He begins dismantling things, bookshelves, chairs, even the chess pieces he once carved from soap and set aside in his drawer. He does it gently, no anger, like someone erasing blueprints. And when asked why, he simply says, because some machines only survive if you forget the operator. In Colombia, a mid-tier freight company dissolves overnight. No public reason. But its corporate structure, mapped by analysts just weeks before, showed a spiral ownership loop. 5 companies, each owning 20% of the next, the last one pointing back to the first. They called it the Ouroboros loop. Guess where the template for that structure first appeared? An old whiteboard photo seized from Antonio's countryside farmhouse in Caserta. He had drawn it years ago, labeled only, when presence, adage, trap, use recursion. No one understood it then. They understand it now. Let's pause and revisit an old detail. The tomato farm. Remember the biometric bunker, the folded ledger, the cup of warm espresso? That property is now in public hands. It's been repurposed into an agricultural co-op, a university-run sustainability project. Students rotate in and out. Professors run soil experiments. All is peaceful, except for one strange discovery made by a doctoral candidate studying root systems. Digging too deep near the back of the property, she finds a rusted pipe embedded in concrete. Inside, 3 vacuum-sealed envelopes. Each contains a single flash drive. When decrypted, the drives reveal not money trails, not confessions, but teaching tools, modules, instructions, datasets, all labeled with neutral names: seed box, mirror frame, pattern delta. The language is neutral. No reference to crime. But the logic is pure Iovine. Tight, recursive, modular. It's like someone left behind an open-source criminal operating system. Many people still think Antonio planned this from the beginning, that everything, the arrest, the trial, the silence, was just a long fade into abstraction. So what do you think? Did he vanish, or did he just dissolve into infrastructure? Back in the prison, a new warden arrives. Younger, less impressed by legends, he tries to confront Antonio, demands answers, tells him, "You've created a myth, and myths don't belong in my corridors." Antonio replies without looking up, "Then turn off the lights." Myths vanish in the dark. The warden does not press further. Let's zoom out. In New Zealand, a renewable energy co-op begins routing their donations through a London-based payment service. That service, in turn, banks with a trust based in Curacao. Curaçao's filings list a foundation, silent since 2005. That foundation, once backed by Camorra Holdings, which of course connects to Atrium, which connects to Antonio. But again, no laws broken, just a quiet hum beneath the surface, a resonance. At this point, Europol releases an internal slide deck titled The Ghost Code, Mapping Influence Beyond Command. It includes 3 quotes attributed to Iovine. Decentralization isn't defense, it's elegance. Never protect a castle, make every brick a castle. When structure becomes habit, the architect is no longer necessary. That third line echoes loudly, because what they're now realizing, painfully, finally, is that Antonio's success was never about concealment. It was about designing inevitability, systems that thrive not in secrecy, but in disinterest. Because the greatest trick? Make the world stop caring. No alarms, no trauma, just boring, effective repetition. A fish company that pays its taxes. A flower shop that breaks even. A co-op that helps the environment. No one investigates what's bland. Antonio understood that early. One last note before we end this chapter. An anonymous donor gifts a sculpture to a museum in Venice. The piece? A bust, faceless, head tilted downward, with threads emerging from its back like roots or wires. Its title? Il Sussurro, the whisper. No artist credited, no origin traced, but etched faintly along the base, in Latin, Silentium est architectus potentiae. Silence is the architect of power, and when shown a photo of the sculpture, Antonio simply blinks once, then places his hand over his heart, softly, briefly, then returns to his chair, and begins erasing. By mid-2017, whispers of the Iovine model begin leaking beyond law enforcement circles, not as accusations, not as warnings, as inspiration. Antonio's name starts to appear, strangely, almost academically, inside financial symposiums, fintech roundtables, and blockchain privacy panels, quietly, not on banners, but in sidebar conversations, hushed references. You know who cracked recursive compliance first, right? Yeah, the Camorra's banker. Iovine. Guy built structures that governed themselves. Suddenly, he's not a fugitive in shackles. He's an uncredited futurist. Let's zoom into Tokyo. A decentralized investment protocol is launched. It uses an architecture that prevents any single node from knowing the full path of a transaction. The design? Legal, audited, celebrated. But someone at a French venture capital firm finds that the test ledger used in the trial phase contains placeholders titled Delta Fog, Yvne Mirror, and Nexo Kernel. The names match fragments found in Iovine's old notebooks, and yet again, no crime committed, just shadows of previous echoes, reassembled as innovation. Even academics join in. A Berlin economics journal publishes a paper titled Financial Disappearance, Ethics in Systems with No Origin Point. Antonio's name is mentioned once in a footnote. It reads, "The Iovine schema remains the clearest early model for transactional diffusion without emotional signature." What a phrase. Without emotional signature. That's the part everyone missed for years. Antonio's genius wasn't just how he hid money. It's that he removed himself from it completely. Not like a ghost pulling strings. More like a fingerprint that dissolved in the rain, but left the mold intact. Back in Milan, he now stops drawing, stops writing. His cell is sterile, his face passive, like someone who's moved beyond the need to gesture. When asked if he'd like new books, he responds, "No, I've begun unlearning." Outside, Naples sees a sudden uptick in street-level stability. Violence drops. Flashy operations cease. The younger crews, once obsessed with clout and image, begin forming small collectives. Low profile, efficient, community-based. Some think the Camorra is falling apart. But others, those who've studied the fog, know it's mutating again. You see, Antonio's doctrine never promoted collapse. It promoted diffusion, not fire, mist. One investigator puts it this way: he didn't train generals, he trained habits. Let's now travel to Lagos, Nigeria. A fintech startup, Fadinex, launches a wallet app for micro-lending between informal markets. It garners praise for its seamless ledger balancing and adaptive anonymity. But when security researchers decompile the app's code, they find a small hidden module labeled IVS Ripple. The code uses a memory-safe loop with staggered failovers, identical to those used in Antonio's 2009 offshore shell company tracker. Again, no direct connection. But the style? Unmistakable. And the name? IVS? It doesn't stand for anything, except possibly Iovine, Velaro, Sussurro, Antonio. The holding, the whisper. Let's turn briefly to language. A quiet phenomenon emerges in certain compliance circles. They start using the term Iovinize as a verb. Did you Iovinize that structure yet? We need to Iovinize this fund's exposure, make it untethered. It means to remove personality from a system, to build something that needs no loyalty, to design so well it forgets you built it. Ironically, Iovine himself had once said, "A good system denies its architect." So this is perhaps his most devout success. Many people still think Antonio foresaw this outcome, the rebranding of his criminal clarity into corporate normalcy, that the line between brilliance and crime was always going to erode, especially if the brilliance outlived the headlines. So what do you think? If a strategy once used for laundering now protects pensions, is the architect guilty or just ahead? Let's go further afield. Argentina. A retired risk analyst, working from his home in Cordoba, discovers an old spreadsheet labeled Model Yvne Arch. It had been sent to him years ago from a Belgian colleague. He never opened it. Inside, a blank template. But hidden in the metadata, instructions in perfect Italian. The first line reads, "Build it forward. If it leans, make the next beam diagonal." The analyst writes a blog post about it, not mentioning Iovine by name, but referring to a man who whispered in blueprints. That blog gets translated, passed around niche design communities. Suddenly, architectural forums begin applying Iovine's structural philosophy to urban planning. A city in Finland drafts a modular housing proposal using his principles: rotating core services, distributed utilities, no single failure point. They don't call it criminal, they call it resilient. And that, right there, is the crux. Antonio's logic, born from necessity, polished by paranoia, baptized in risk, is now a template for survivability, not because it was moral, but because it was correct. Inside prison, the guards shift again. New faces, less patience. One notices the complete absence of material in Antonio's cell. Not even toilet paper notes, just stillness. He asks, "You don't keep anything, do you?" Antonio replies, "I've kept everything. You just don't see where." And maybe that's the lesson, because while men built empires on thrones, Antonio built an empire with no surface. And now the surface belongs to everyone else. Spring 2018, and the term post-figure finance begins surfacing in think tanks. No one credits Antonio Iovine directly, but everyone understands the subtext. These aren't just systems designed to avoid a figurehead. They're systems that function better without one, as if having a name, a face, a signature is a liability, not a strength. And for those who've studied the fog long enough, they nod quietly. Because this isn't just new economics, it's the Iovine template, finally normalized. Let's take a breath and look at Brazil. A chain of modular health clinics begins operating in favelas, smartly, efficiently, without external charity or visible management. They bill themselves as autonomous aid collectives. Their funding? Crowdsourced and fractional. But behind the walls, the digital ledger used to track inventory and patient data includes a traceable reference to a system once flagged by Interpol, a ghost code dubbed YFADE8. Antonio had sketched a version of it in 2011, weeks before his capture, in a note found inside a hollowed-out economics textbook. The clinics, of course, do good work. People get care. Children get medicine. So when the thread is pulled, gently, investigators hesitate. Do you dismantle a cure because its skeleton resembles a crime? That's the new moral landscape. And Antonio? He no longer resists or explains. He simply exists. Occasionally, he moves a piece of lint on his bed sheet, adjusts the spacing between folded towels. Once, a guard finds him rearranging grains of rice into a spiral. When asked why, he whispers, "To remember how chaos tastes when it organizes itself." It's not nonsense. It's Antonio living inside abstraction. Let's go to Mumbai. A textile conglomerate launches a micro-investment platform for artisans. Entirely legal, audited, transparent. But one of the back-end developers recognizes a strange behavior. The code self-replicates on modular servers based on variable cash flow. It was never built to do that. Upon inspection, the trigger logic matches an early recursion loop found in the YVNI Offshore 4.2 framework, an architecture reportedly built in fragments during Antonio's fugitive years. Again, no direct proof. But again, the feeling, that same hum, that same patience, it becomes clear now. Antonio never needed control. He only needed the pattern to outlive him. Many people still think that by going silent, he gave the fog permission to spread. That silence wasn't absence. It was a breeding ground. So what do you think? If a man says nothing for years, but the world starts sounding like him, did he really stop speaking? Let's bring it back to Naples. The Camorra has changed. Gone are the chaotic turf wars, the flashy raids, the egos with nicknames. Now, what remains is shape, movement, behavior. A city official, while auditing local sanitation contracts, notices something strange. A cluster of small firms, none connected on paper, all bidding on alternating days with uncanny balance. Each firm makes just enough to stay afloat. No sudden growth, no visible profit spikes. But together, they cover the entire market. When modeled visually, the bids form a spiral grid. No center. Remind you of anything? An old drawing recovered from Antonio's countryside hideout. 4 spirals overlapping, each labeled with a verb: divide, drift, fold, hum. The city doesn't file charges. They just observe and quietly begin mapping other markets: pharmaceuticals, construction, transport. The spiral repeats, like a tune no one admits to humming. Back in Milan, Antonio is taken to walking in squares. Literally. In his 30 minutes of yard time, he traces the same path. 4 perfect corners, over and over. A guard, now used to his patterns, jokes, "Trying to wear a hole into geometry?" Antonio smiles, first time in weeks. "No, just proving you can loop inside a box." It's a metaphor, of course. Everything with him is. But it also explains everything, because Antonio didn't invent a gang. He invented a form, one that could live inside banks and boats and building permits. One that fed itself with monotony and hid inside structure. One that even now is being mimicked, modified, and passed around by people who may never know his name. In Tokyo, a coder adds a feature to his app: silent routing fallback. The logic is elegant, the style unmistakable. In Paris, a startup's internal document describes mirror cycling in its payment tiers. The phrasing is old, but it resonates. In Prague, a data visualization firm maps international transit corruption, unwittingly drawing the exact same 5-node interlock diagram Antonio once traced in soap on a cell wall. This isn't about evidence anymore. It's about echo. And those echoes? They're gaining fidelity. You might wonder, what does Antonio feel knowing his fog has become a climate? A culture? Truthfully, no one knows. But there is one story. A nurse at the prison infirmary claims she saw him, one winter morning, standing perfectly still, staring at the condensation forming on the window. Not the outside, not the frost, but the pattern. And when asked what he saw, he didn't answer with words. He just breathed, long, even, complete, as if the fog had come home. Winter 2018 arrives like a whisper, cold, even in southern Italy, and slower somehow. The city of Milan tightens its coat collars, and in the prison's concrete yard, Antonio Iovine continues his square walks, his rice spirals, his controlled breaths. The guards don't watch him as closely anymore, not because they trust him, because they've stopped believing he's the threat. But outside, the world he once choreographed continues to ripple, not explosively, quietly, patiently. In Tallinn, Estonia, a government data breach causes minor political fallout. Nothing scandalous. But among the exposed files is a funding pipeline labeled Comunitas 3. It's a civic program designed to route small-scale municipal repairs through shared infrastructure bids. The program's originator? A now defunct legal firm with traces, faint, barely legible, linking back to a Gibraltar address last connected to Antonio's network in 2007. Once again, it's clean, audited, helpful. But when diagrammed by a transparency watchdog, its budget cycle mimics the same 11-week pulse we saw in tri-band modular. Remember that? 11 in, 11 out, a breath. Antonio's rhythm. It's as if the world never stopped breathing in his time signature. Back in Italy, a mid-level prosecutor requests access to Antonio's original case files for review. They're scattered, some digitized, others in dusty storage. Among them is an overlooked notebook, previously dismissed as unrelated. It's a travel log, not of places he went, but of places he never went to. Cities, dates, all blank. Except each entry includes 2 things: a time of day, usually between 2:10 and 3:15 a.m., a short phrase, observer unentered. What does that mean? Many people still think that Iovine was mapping not geography but absence, tracking the limits of surveillance, the corners no one watched. So what do you think? If a man records only the shadows he doesn't cast, what's he building? Back in Naples, a low-tier runner is arrested on extortion charges. Nothing new. But when authorities examine his phone, they find a list of code names, all of them reference types of fog: pea soup, sea mist, tool drift. They ask him what the names mean. He shrugs, says he got them from an old contact who used to pass around blueprints no one could explain. No fingerprints, no photos, but one of the fog terms, argent glaze, is the exact phrase Antonio once used in a coded message that led investigators to a plastic factory in Salerno. Coincidence or inheritance? Let's go to Montreal. Remember the Fondazione di Marea? The cultural center with legal status, clean books, and to perfect symmetry? It has a new wing now. A library. Every shelf contains financial histories, legal case studies, compliance strategies, all in multiple languages. Anyone can visit. And carved above the entrance, in polished steel, is a line translated into French. L'absence est une forme. Absence is a forme. It's subtle, almost poetic. But for those who know, it's a signature, because that phrase, exactly that phrasing, was scribbled into the margin of an old email from Antonio to a now-retired Swiss advisor. That email was never sent. It was found in drafts, left open, like a trail, or a dare. In Milan, Antonio is offered transfer, a quieter wing, better food. He declines, says the current is already optimal. No one pushes further, because the system now treats him like a fixed variable, a concept, like gravity, present, dependable, unmoved. But what they fail to realize is that Antonio is still moving, just not inside walls. He's become the template, the world, its architects, its programmers, its launderers and lawful planners, now build with pieces he first carved. Do you remember his earliest rule? Build it forward. That rule now appears, verbatim, in a policy draft by an NGO in Nairobi teaching young entrepreneurs about sustainable financing. They don't know who said it first. It was just in the materials they found, translated, typed, credited to no one, but it spreads. And now, here's the question no one dares ask. What happens when the design stops needing the designer altogether? When the fog moves itself? In Paris, a researcher compiles a lineage map of modern dispersed finance. She traces 5 recurring patterns across 12 years of development. She calls them the echo hands. 1, the loop; 2, the fog; 3, the breath; 4, the erase; 5, the whisper. Every single one can be found in systems built after 2010, in places where Antonio has never set foot. And yet, everyone matches something from his past. He isn't vanishing. He's atomizing. Back in the prison yard, Antonio stops walking in squares. He begins tracing infinite loops, soft curves, no corners, a pattern only he can see. And when asked, why the change, he says, the world has corners, but the fog doesn't. He's smiling when he says it, eyes clear, breath steady, as if somehow it's already begun. Early 2019. A quiet audit is conducted on a Swedish telecommunications firm after irregular billing patterns emerge. Not fraud, not embezzlement, just silence where there should have been traceable processes. The oddity? Every routing change happens at exactly 4:44 a.m. every 11th day, always within a 90-second window. A junior analyst, fascinated, follows the pattern backwards, through timestamps, server logs, transaction echoes. What she finds isn't malice, it's architecture. A self-tuning framework that reallocates bandwidth based on energy grid load, regulatory pressure, and regional latency. She posts a technical breakdown on a private engineering forum, ending with a throwaway line. Whoever designed this thinks like fog. The post goes viral. In the replies, someone shares an image, a fragment of an old chalkboard, photographed in a dim Calabrian cellar years ago, during the raid that ended Antonio Iovine's flight. In the corner of that board, 444. Air's tipping point. Use it. We don't know what Antonio meant, but someone built something from it. Do you see the pattern now? Not of crime, but of abstraction applied practically. Iovine didn't infect the world with criminal methods. He infected it with structure divorced from identity. A former bank IT consultant in Frankfurt writes a Medium post titled, "The Pattern That Denies Its Author." He describes seeing code fragments, policy routines, even management models that seem to operate as if they'd been born from the same mind, then cut loose and allowed to evolve without ego. In the article, he speculates that the ultimate Iovine legacy isn't crime. It's the erasure of origin as a feature, not a bug. Meanwhile, back in Naples, an old bar closes. It's been there for decades. A nobody kind of place where locals used to say Antonio sometimes drank. During demolition, workers find a hidden panel in the cellar, and behind it, a sealed envelope. No cash, no ledgers, just a single page with a hand-drawn spiral. At the bottom, do not inherit control. Inherit pace. It's unsigned, but the handwriting exactly matches a 1995 letter Antonio wrote to his brother, preserved in police archives. Elsewhere, his fingerprints continue surfacing, not on surfaces, but in systems. An urban farming network in Mexico City begins adopting a modular resource cycle that closely resembles the bid-split timing model of Antonio's early shell firms. The founder is asked whether he ever studied Iovine. He says no, but when shown a diagram from 2006, the one Iovine once called Ghost Spine Beta, he stares for a long moment, then whispers, "We called ours the Feather. Same shape. You see? Even the names drift." Back in Milan, Antonio begins a new ritual. Each day he sits at the same table. Same hour, same chair, but now he stares at a blank wall. No books, no papers, no movement. A guard once jokes, "You look like you're waiting for a message." Antonio replies, "Not waiting, listening, because even silence to him is alive." Let's pivot to language. A professor at the University of Chicago publishes a lecture series titled Anonymity as Intent, Lessons from Distributed Systems. One module focuses entirely on Iovine, not as a criminal, but as a design paradigm. The lecture posits, if every architect eventually removes himself, what happens when that removal becomes the design? Students debate. Was he dangerous? Was he brilliant? Did he corrupt clean systems or reveal their latent flexibility? Many people still think Antonio intended this duality, that by disappearing into his own code, into paperless finance, into vanishing spirals, he engineered a way to live forever without ever being found. So what do you think? If a man no longer exists in flesh, but his methods keep breathing in systems, do we call him gone or just redefined? We return one last time to the countryside farm, the place of his final capture, now a cooperative. One student in an economics program wanders past the tree line, beyond the tended fields. There's an old olive press there, unused. Inside its hollow, behind rusted iron, he finds a weathered notebook, not hidden, placed. Inside, dozens of pages. Each one describes a process, not a plan. Routing systems for aid, modular flood relief strategies, cash dispersal cycles that avoid corruption through deliberate boredom. No names, no branding, just clarity. The last page reads, "The quieter it moves, the longer it lives. And if you must vanish, leave behind a rhythm. Rhythm needs no statue." He hands the notebook to his professor. They publish it online, open source, under the title, Iovine Structures, Notes Toward Nonlinear Resilience. It spreads, gets cited. A London firm uses it to streamline refugee housing logistics. A startup in Jakarta adopts it to manage port inventory with 70% less waste. In every adaptation, the original words blur, but the logic still holds, because Antonio never wanted worship. He wanted influence without maintenance, and now his ghost builds cities. Summer 2019. By now, Antonio Iovine has become less a man and more a phrase, not whispered in fear, but invoked in reverence or curiosity or quiet disbelief. The media has largely moved on. His trial is over, his sentence fixed. No appeals pending, no fresh scandals to chase. But in the undercurrents, where systems hum and cities breathe, his influence only deepens. Let's begin in Kenya. A decentralized aid initiative launches in Nairobi. It routes donations not through centralized NGOs, but through micro-verified nodes. Barbershops, churches, small grocers, no single node knows the full network. No one controls the flow. Every week, the liquidity breathes outward, then tightens again, like a lung. The lead architect of the program credits a mysterious archive of financial diagrams, uploaded anonymously to a forgotten BitTorrent seed 5 years ago. The folder was named Vivni Pulse Model, Build It Forward. Sound familiar? No signatures, no authors, but inside, a full set of instructions, written in the style of a man who once said, design should be invisible, but inevitable. Back in Italy, Antonio declines another interview. A French magazine had offered to do a profile, elegant, soft focus, philosophical. He refuses. His reasoning? I already said everything I needed to, just not with words. That, in the end, might be the most honest thing he's ever said. Let's turn to Japan. A startup in Osaka announces a breakthrough in predictive supply chains. Their software adjusts itself, not based on demand, but on what the system refuses to see. Their CTO says, in a now viral TEDx talk, our model is designed to trust the gaps. Sometimes absence tells you more than presence. He's asked afterward where he learned that logic. He shrugs and says, I read it somewhere in a zine. I think it was from Italy, long time ago. In the margins of the company's internal code, documentation is a diagram, 5 circles spiraling inward. The file is titled Iovine's Loops. They didn't name it. It was already called that. Back in Milan, the prison undergoes renovations. New windows, cleaner lighting, updated surveillance. Antonio watches the workers quietly, observes their routes, the way materials arrive and vanish again. One afternoon, he offers a suggestion about material handling. The foreman asks how he knows so much. Antonio smiles faintly. I used to design systems, and walks away. Later, the foreman realizes his logistics have improved. No one knows how, but everything's smoother. A guard jokes. Even his advice launders itself. Let's pan wider. In an academic journal from Norway, a researcher writes a paper titled Criminal Elegance, When Illegality Teaches Infrastructure. The core thesis? That in their attempt to evade systems, men like Iovine accidentally perfect them, not by breaking the rules, by transcending the need for them. In this new world of modular governance, micro-funding, decentralized coordination, and anonymous validation, Antonio's old crimes feel less like defiance, more like foreshadowing. He didn't resist the future. He anticipated it. And now, that future quietly thanks him. With each anonymous server ping, each whispered code push, each startup that launches without asking permission. Many people still think that Antonio, by vanishing from his own structures, created a world that finally understood his absence as brilliance. So what do you think? If a man stops appearing, but his design grows stronger, did he disappear or simply finish his work? Let's visit one last place, an unmarked graveyard in northern Calabria. No, Antonio's not dead, but a local mason paid anonymously installs a stone there. No name, no date, just an engraving. Pace is pattern, pattern is legacy. He's never asked who ordered it, but when the final payment arrives, the envelope contains only a small folded spiral, hand-drawn. No signature. You understand now, don't you? This was never about empire, or crime, or even escape. It was about longevity without spotlight, design without demand, presence without performance, and so the fog moves on. It lingers in code, in contracts, in customs. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It just works, quietly, efficiently, forever. And so we leave Antonio Iovine, not in a blaze, not behind bars and chains, but dissolved, gently, into the systems he once sculpted. The lights dim slowly now, as if even the story itself knows it's time to rest. Your thoughts may drift through those quiet spirals, the ones he drew with a fingertip on prison glass, or into the rhythm of breath behind numbers, names, and fading echoes. There's something deeply calming about it, isn't there? To know that the most lasting forces in this world often move unseen, not loud, not grand, just patient, just consistent. Maybe that's the lesson buried beneath all the cleverness and shadows. That legacy doesn't have to be loud. That power doesn't have to speak. That you, yes, you, don't need a name carved in marble to be felt, remembered, or understood. So, let your mind soften now. Let the fog wrap you, not in fear, but in ease. Each breath an echo, each silence a design. You made it here to the final whisper. Thanks for walking beside the quiet tonight. Sleep comes easier in stories without sharp edges. The world keeps humming. The systems spin without sound. And somewhere, out there, another rhythm takes root. Good night, listener. The fog is watching over you now.